boy becomes overnight millionaire. What happens will shock you. The flickering fluorescent lights of Chuck's diner cast harsh shadows across Sarah Smith's pale face as she stumbled against the counter. The midnight crowd had thinned to a few regulars, their coffee cups forming rings on worn formica. Her trembling hands clutched a pot of coffee, knuckles white with effort. Across the street, through the diner's foggy windows, the Bradley mansion's lights blazed like a cruel reminder of the life her son now lived without her. "More coffee," Mrs. Henderson Sarah's voice wavered as she approached the elderly woman's table. The room began to spin, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. The coffee pot slipped from her grasp, shattering against the linoleum floor. Dark liquid spread like spilled secrets across the checkered pattern. From his perch in the Bradleys' third-floor study, 11-year-old Trey Smith watched the scene unfold. Brandon Bradley stood beside him, designer watch glinting as he checked the time. "Look at that," Brandon smirked. "Guess some people just aren't cut out for the finer things in life." The words hit Trey like physical blows, but he forced a laugh, adjusting his custom-tailored jacket. Through the window, he saw Mrs. Henderson rush to his mother's side as Sarah crumpled to the floor. The same woman who had once shared her homemade cookies with him now cradled his mother's head, screaming for someone to call 911. Other diners crowded around, their faces illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. "Mum," the whisper escaped before Trey could stop it. Brandon's calculating gaze snapped to his face. "Did you say something, Smith?" The question carried a warning. 3 months of carefully constructed social climbing teetered on the edge of that single word. But Trey wasn't listening anymore. Through the mansion's crystal-clear windows, he watched emergency lights paint the street in alternating red and white. Paramedics rushed into the diner, pushing through the growing crowd of onlookers. His mother's waitress uniform stood out starkly against the gurney they wheeled her out on. "Probably just another charity case looking for attention," Brandon's father Richard commented, entering the room with a crystal tumbler of scotch. "Speaking of charity, Trey, about those investment papers we discussed." As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens fading into the night, Trey felt something crack inside his carefully constructed new world. The sound echoed back to where it all began, 3 months ago on his 10th birthday. 12 years ago, Dr. Sarah Anderson stood in Memorial Hospital's emergency room, her steady hands earning her the nickname the miracle worker among her colleagues. As the youngest chief resident in the hospital's history, her career trajectory seemed unstoppable. The staff still spoke of the night she saved 6 car crash victims in succession, working 18 hours straight without a single mistake. Her research on trauma care protocols was being considered for national implementation. That's where she met James Smith, a young teacher whose passion for education matched her dedication to medicine. He had brought in a student who couldn't afford proper medical care, personally covering the bill with his teacher's salary. Sarah noticed how he held the frightened child's hand throughout the examination, telling stories to distract from the pain. Their eyes met over the hospital bed, and something clicked into place. Their courtship was a whirlwind of coffee dates between her hospital shifts and his late-night grading sessions. James would wait outside the ER with fresh coffee after her most challenging surgeries, never complaining about the blood on her scrubs or the exhaustion in her eyes. They shared dreams over hurried lunches in the hospital cafeteria, her plans to open a free clinic, his vision of a school where no child would be turned away for lack of funds. Eleanor Anderson, Sarah's mother, watched their love story unfold with quiet joy. A retired school teacher herself, she recognized in James the same dedication to serving others that she had instilled in her daughter. When James asked for Eleanor's blessing to propose, she gave him her own mother's wedding ring. "Love leaves marks on our hearts," she told him, "just like life leaves marks on gold." The wedding was small but filled with purpose. Instead of an expensive reception, they donated to the children's ward at Memorial. Sarah wore her mother's dress, and James' students formed an impromptu choir. Eleanor's pride shone brighter than any diamond as she watched two people dedicated to making the world better pledge their lives to each other. And their modest apartment became a hub of hope. James tutored struggling students at their kitchen table while Sarah worked on plans for medical outreach programs. They lived simply but felt rich in purpose. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant, James transformed their spare room into a nursery, painting educational murals on the walls. "Our child will grow up understanding the value of service," he promised, hand resting on Sarah's growing belly. But fate had other plans. On a rainy Tuesday night, James stayed late at school helping a student prepare for college entrance exams. The drunk driver who ran the red light had a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit. Sarah was working the ER when they brought James in, his body broken beyond her considerable skills to repair. She performed CPR until her colleagues physically pulled her away, her scrubs soaked with her husband's blood. Eleanor moved in temporarily after the funeral, watching her daughter's grief transform into determination. Sarah returned to work just 2 weeks later, channeling her pain into helping others. But the hospital's budget cuts came at the worst possible time. Despite her exemplary record, Sarah was laid off 6 months after Trey was born. The hospital's new corporate ownership had no place for a doctor known for treating patients regardless of their ability to pay. The medical bills from Trey's birth, combined with James's funeral costs, quickly depleted their modest savings. Sarah sold everything except James's journal and Eleanor's ring, determined to keep her son fed and sheltered. The prestigious job offers that had once filled her inbox disappeared when potential employers learned she was a single mother. The medical community that had once celebrated her skills now turned its back, concerned about liability and scheduling flexibility. Eleanor watched her brilliant daughter take a job waiting tables at Chuck's Diner, then another stocking shelves at the market, and finally a night cleaning position. Sarah's medical degree hung on the wall like a monument to broken dreams, gathering dust while she learned to survive on 4 hours of sleep between shifts. But she never lost her compassion. Regulars at the diner spoke of how she would slip extra food to hungry kids and bandage injured customers with professional care. Through it all, Eleanor remained their anchor, watching Trey, while Sarah worked and slipping them extra money from her teacher's pension. She filled their small apartment with books and music, teaching Trey about his father's dreams and his mother's sacrifices. True wealth, she would tell him, isn't in what you have, but in what you give. No one expected Eleanor's heart attack, least of all Sarah. The loss of their support system hit hard, but Eleanor's final gift was the wisdom she had shared. Her diary, found after her death, contained pages of hopes for Sarah and Trey and warnings about the corrupting influence of wealth without purpose. Money can buy comfort, she had written, but only love can bring joy. The Anderson-Smith legacy was rich in purpose if not in possessions. Sarah kept both her married and maiden names, honoring the families that had shaped her. Each morning, she would touch James's photo and Eleanor's ring before heading to her first shift, carrying their strength with her. The world saw a waitress in a faded uniform, but inside beat the heart of a healer who had learned that sometimes the greatest service comes in the humblest forms. The transition from respected doctor to struggling single mother hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. Each morning began at 4:30 a.m., preparing Trey's lunch while still in her cleaning uniform from the night shift. The pristine scrubs she once wore were replaced by 3 different uniforms, each representing another layer of their descent into poverty. Her hands, once steady enough for microsurgery, developed calluses from scrubbing floors and washing dishes. The small apartment they had once considered temporary became their permanent home, each rent payment a monthly battle. Sarah learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed, mixing water with milk to make it last longer, mending clothes until the patches had patches, calculating bus routes to save on transportation. The electricity bills became a monthly puzzle, with Sarah often working by candlelight after Trey went to bed to save money. Eleanor watched her daughter's transformation with a mixture of pride and heartache. The brilliant surgeon who had once commanded operating rooms now memorized discount schedules for every grocery store in walking distance. Yet Sarah's dignity never wavered. She ironed Trey's second-hand school uniforms with the same precision she had once used in surgery, determined that her son would never feel the full weight of their poverty. "Remember who you are," Eleanor would say, helping Sarah count coins for the laundromat. "Circumstances change, but character remains." These quiet moments between mother and daughter became their sanctuary, where Sarah could briefly let her guard down, allowing tears to fall for the life they had lost. Eleanor would hold her daughter, humming the same lullabies she had used to comfort Sarah's childhood hurts. Trey grew into a thoughtful child, inheriting his father's gentle nature and his mother's determination. By age 6, he understood not to ask for the snacks his classmates enjoyed or the new toys advertised on TV. Instead, he took pride in helping Eleanor organize coupons and carrying groceries for elderly neighbors. His teachers praised his academic performance, never knowing he completed homework by streetlight when the electricity was cut off. The medical community's rejection cut deeper than their financial struggles. Sarah's former colleagues crossed the street to avoid her, embarrassed by their association with a waitress. Hospital administrators who had once sought her opinions now barely met her eyes when she brought Trey in for checkups. The free clinic she had dreamed of opening became a bitter memory, replaced by careful calculations of which symptoms warranted spending precious dollars on medical care. Eleanor's support became their lifeline. She transformed their limitations into learning opportunities, teaching Trey to find joy in simple pleasures. Together they turned cardboard boxes into spaceships, used old newspapers for art projects, and created adventure stories about ordinary objects. "Your mother," she would tell Trey, "is the richest person I know in things that truly matter." But the world's judgment was relentless. Other mothers at school whispered about Sarah's multiple jobs, suggesting her absence meant neglect rather than sacrifice. The PTA meeting she couldn't attend due to work became fodder for gossip. Each parent-teacher conference meant lost wages, yet Sarah never missed one, arriving in her waitress uniform, exhausted but attentive. The breaking point came when Trey needed emergency dental surgery. Sarah, who had once performed complex medical procedures, couldn't afford basic care for her own child. She pawned James's wedding ring, the decision feeling like a final surrender of their former life. Eleanor witnessed her daughter's silent tears as she signed the pawn ticket, understanding that some sacrifices leave permanent scars on the soul. Their small victories became precious treasures. Trey's perfect attendance awards, Sarah's Employee of the Month recognition at the diner, Eleanor's successful budget-stretching recipes. They celebrated with homemade cards and small treats saved from Sarah's tips. These moments of joy, Eleanor insisted, were worth more than any luxury their former life had offered. The neighborhood watched the family struggle with mixed reactions. Some, like Mrs. Henderson, offered quiet support a casserole when Sarah worked late, hand-me-down clothes still in good condition. Others saw them as a cautionary tale, whispering about the dangers of marrying beneath one's social class. Eleanor fiercely defended her daughter against these judgments, her teacher's authority silencing many critics. Through it all, Sarah kept James's journal on her nightstand, reading his dreams for educational equality to Trey. Eleanor added her own stories about James's kindness, ensuring her grandson knew his father's legacy went beyond their current hardships. These evening storytelling sessions became their family ritual, a reminder that love persists even when everything else fails. The medical degree remained on the wall, not as a reminder of what was lost, but as proof of what Sarah had achieved. "Your mother," Eleanor would tell Trey, "didn't stop being a healer when she left the hospital. She just finds different ways to help people now." This truth was evident in how Sarah treated everyone from bandaging injured children at the playground to offering comfort to elderly diner customers who just needed someone to listen. The Bradley mansion stood like a towering monument to wealth at the end of Oak Street, its manicured lawns and gleaming windows a stark contrast to the working-class homes surrounding it. Richard Bradley had built his fortune through what he called urban renewal, buying struggling neighborhoods and transforming them into luxury developments, leaving displaced families to fade into statistics in his quarterly reports. Victoria Bradley orchestrated the family's social dominance with surgical precision. Her charity galas were legendary, carefully designed to showcase their wealth, while maintaining a veneer of community service. She chaired every significant committee at Preston Elementary, ensuring her influence touched every aspect of school life. Privilege, she often declared at PTA meetings, comes with responsibility. Though her version of responsibility rarely extended beyond writing checks and organizing fundraisers where minimum donations exceeded most families' monthly income. Brandon Bradley, their only son, had perfected the art of social manipulation by age 11. He moved through school hallways like a young prince, his designer uniforms and latest technology creating an invisible barrier between himself and his ordinary classmates. His friendship was a commodity, carefully allocated to maintain maximum influence. Teachers praised his leadership skills, conveniently overlooking how he subtly orchestrated the social isolation of students he deemed unworthy. The Bradleys' influence seeped into every corner of the community. Richard's company, Bradley Development, owned most of the commercial properties in town. Small business owners lived in constant fear of rent increases or sudden eviction notices. The local newspaper, heavily dependent on Bradley advertising revenue, carefully curated its coverage to maintain the family's approval. Even the police department's new patrol cars bore the Bradley Development logo, a generous donation that came with unspoken expectations. Victoria's charity foundation became a masterclass in social engineering. She organized food drives where photographers captured her distributing donations, while quietly pressuring the city council to close homeless shelters that might decrease property values. Her annual Future Leaders Scholarship program explicitly favored children from influential families, though its public mission statement emphasized equal opportunity. Brandon's social court at school operated with the same calculated efficiency as his father's business empire. He maintained a detailed mental hierarchy of his classmates, categorizing them by their family's wealth, influence, and potential usefulness. His birthday parties became significant social events, with invitations treated like currency in the elementary school social economy. Children lucky enough to be invited were expected to arrive with appropriately expensive gifts and unquestioning loyalty. The Bradley family's seasonal events set the community's social calendar. Their Christmas lighting ceremony drew local news coverage, while their 4th of July celebrations rivaled professional productions. These events served as carefully staged demonstrations of their dominance, with Victoria orchestrating seating arrangements to reinforce social hierarchies. Even their household staff were selected to project the right image, with uniforms designed by the same company that supplied luxury hotels. Their influence extended into education through strategic donations. The Bradley Computer Lab, the Bradley Athletic Field, and the Bradley Arts Center served as constant reminders of their generosity. Teachers understood that children from certain families required special consideration, their grades and opportunities magically aligning with their parents' social status. The school principal's office displayed a large photo of Richard Bradley presenting an oversized check, a daily reminder of who really controlled the institution. Behind their perfectly maintained facade, the Bradleys viewed the community as their personal chessboard. Richard's business meetings often determined which local shops would survive another year. Victoria's social committees decided which families would receive invitations to important events, effectively controlling access to networking opportunities. Brandon's childhood friendships were carefully monitored and adjusted to align with his parents' business interests. Their treatment of service workers revealed their true character. Housekeepers were fired for minor infractions, local vendors were made to wait months for payment, and anyone who dared complain found themselves mysteriously unable to find work in town. They viewed people like Sarah Smith, as part of the landscape necessary but invisible, worthy of occasional performative charity but never genuine respect. The Bradleys' annual community appreciation event perfectly encapsulated their approach. They would open their grounds to the public, allowing carefully supervised tours of their gardens while security guards ensured no one strayed too close to the house. Victoria would make a speech about community unity, standing safely elevated on their terrace, while Brandon distributed pre-packaged gift bags to selected children, the contents calculated to remind recipients of the social gulf between them. Local businesses learned to display Bradley Development's logo prominently, understanding that their survival depended on maintaining the family's goodwill. The town's architecture gradually transformed to match Bradley's vision, with historic buildings disappearing beneath modern facades and chain stores replacing family businesses. They called it progress, though many wondered precisely who was progressing. Each Christmas, the Bradleys would adopt a less fortunate family, ensuring photographers captured their generosity. These performances of charity carefully avoided addressing the systemic issues their own business practices created. Victoria would pose with donated toys while Richard's company continued evicting families from affordable housing units slated for luxury development. Patterson's Market stood as the last independent grocery store in town, its weathered brick facade and hand-painted window signs a defiant contrast to the sleek chain stores dominating Main Street. Mr. Patterson, 73 years old, with eyes that crinkled when he smiled, operated the store with old-world dignity. He kept a notebook of customers who could pay when times get better, though his own suppliers demanded payment on delivery. Every morning he would quietly mark down day-old bread and place it where struggling mothers could easily find it. Mrs. Henderson lived in the apartment above the Smiths, her 78 years carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen the neighborhood transform from working-class haven to endangered community. Her small pension stretched to include occasional treats for neighborhood children, and her door remained open to those needing a quiet place to escape life's hardships. Despite arthritis in her hands, she still baked cookies for families facing tough times, delivering them with stories that made the recipients feel like they were doing her a favor by accepting. The Chen family ran the Golden Dragon restaurant 3 blocks from Patterson's Market, their 16-hour workdays a testament to immigrant determination. Amy Chen, their daughter and Trey's classmate, shared her lunch with students who forgot theirs, never mentioning that her own family often ate simple rice to afford these extras. Mr. Chen fixed neighborhood kids' bicycles for free, while Mrs. Chen kept a pot of soup simmering for anyone who looked hungry. Marcus Washington's father worked as head janitor at Preston Elementary, his midnight shifts allowing him to attend every school event during the day. Marcus inherited his father's quiet dignity, never showing shame when wearing hand-me-downs or bringing simple sandwiches for lunch. The Washingtons' small apartment became an unofficial after-school study haven, with Mr. Washington helping with math homework while his wife Lisa stretched dinner to feed unexpected guests. Preston Elementary itself reflected the community's stark divisions. The cafeteria had an invisible line separating students who brought lunch from those receiving free meals. Teachers struggled to balance educational needs with social pressures, watching bright students from poor families fade into the background while wealthy children commanded attention. The annual science fair became a showcase of economic disparity, with some projects clearly assembled from dollar store materials, while others featured expensive electronics. The public library, run by elderly Miss Martinez, served as a sanctuary for students who couldn't afford internet at home. She kept the computers running well past closing time during exam periods, pretending not to notice children doing homework in the warmth of the reading room when their own homes had no heat. Her brother, Dr. Martinez, ran a small medical practice where payment plans were quietly arranged and prescriptions somehow cost less for certain families. The diner where Sarah worked became a community hub, its worn booths holding stories of triumph and tragedy. Regular customers formed an informal support network, leaving generous tips when they could and sharing job opportunities over coffee. The cook, Big Mike, was known for preparing the steak meals that coincidentally matched what struggling families usually ordered. At the local bus stop, Ms. Thompson, a retired nurse, kept unofficial watch over children waiting for parents working late shifts. Her apartment overlooking the stop stockpiled spare umbrellas, warm scarves, and emergency snacks. She remembered every child's birthday, producing small gifts that seemed to cost nothing but meant everything. The community's strength lay in these interconnected relationships. When the Ramirez family faced eviction, neighbors pooled resources for their security deposit on a new apartment. When young Tommy Anderson needed emergency surgery, bake sales and car washes appeared across the neighborhood. These actions happened quietly, without fanfare or public recognition, a stark contrast to the Bradleys' orchestrated charity events. The annual neighborhood block party, organized in rotating backyards to avoid permit fees, showcased their resilience. Everyone contributed what they could: Mrs. Chen's dumplings, Mr. Washington's grilling skills, Miss Martinez's storytelling. Children played together without awareness of social barriers, while adults shared resources disguised as recipes and household tips. Even the local police officer, Officer Rivera, understood the community's delicate balance. He would forget to issue tickets for minor violations, instead helping fix broken taillights or expired registrations. His patrol car often slowed near groups of children walking home late, offering unofficial escorts through darker streets. The laundromat, managed by elderly Mr. and Mrs. Kim, became another community anchor. They kept a basket of abandoned socks matched into pairs, available to anyone who needed them. Their daughter Jenny tutored younger children while their parents worked, turning the back room into an impromptu classroom between wash cycles. These community members formed an invisible safety net, catching families before they fell too far. They operated on an unspoken barter system: childcare exchanged for home repairs, meals traded for tutoring, dignity preserved through careful fiction of mutual benefit rather than charity. Their actions created a parallel economy based on compassion and shared experience, surviving despite the Bradleys' growing influence. The single candle on Trey's chocolate cupcake cast a feeble glow across his face as Sarah watched from their small kitchen, still wearing her diner uniform from the morning shift. The day-old cupcake had been a gift from Big Mike at the diner, adorned with slightly melted frosting in the stuffy apartment. Through their window, music and laughter drifted up from the Bradley mansion, where Brandon's elaborate birthday celebration was in full swing, complete with a professional DJ and what looked like half of Preston Elementary's 5th grade. "Make a wish," honey, Sarah whispered, her voice betraying exhaustion despite her attempt at cheerfulness. Her name tag hung slightly crooked, dark circles shadowing her eyes after rushing home between shifts just to be here for this moment. Trey's fingers clutched the worn envelope in his pocket, an invitation to Brandon's party that he'd never shown his mother. "Hey, poor boy, come watch me unbox my new PS5 collection," it had read in Brandon's neat handwriting. "Maybe you can learn what a real birthday looks like." Mrs. Henderson arrived first, carrying a small package wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. Mr. Patterson followed with day-old pastries from his store, and a few kids from the building whose parents couldn't afford after-school care completed their modest celebration. These were Trey's everyday people, the ones who shared their simple lives in this aging apartment complex. Sarah's face lit up at their arrival, but Trey noticed her hands trembling as she reached for her gift, a second-hand science book he'd been eyeing in the thrift store window. Just then, cruel laughter erupted from outside. Brandon and his friends had gathered on their perfectly manicured lawn, phones pointed up at Trey's window. "Look at that pathetic little party," Brandon's voice carried clearly through the thin glass. "Bet that's not even a real cake." Trey's face burned with shame as he saw his mother's expression crumple for just a second before she forced a smile back on. He knew she had picked up extra night shifts at the diner for weeks, probably skipping meals to afford even this simple celebration. The $5 bill in his pocket, their last grocery money until Sarah's next payday, felt heavy with possibility. While the adults chatted in the kitchen, Trey slipped out to Patterson's Market. The elderly shopkeeper raised an eyebrow when the boy requested a lottery ticket, but something in Trey's expression stopped his usual lecture about gambling. "Just this once," Mr. Patterson said softly, accepting the crumpled bill. "But don't tell your mother." That evening, as Sarah rested between shifts on their worn couch, Trey watched the lottery drawing on their ancient television. The reception was poor, but the numbers came through clearly enough: 723, 1441, 36, and lucky number 9. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the ticket as he checked the numbers once, twice, 3 times. "Mom," his voice cracked. "Mom, I think we won." The next hours passed in a blur. Mr. Patterson verified the ticket after hours, his hands trembling as much as Trey's. Calls were made, forms were signed, and their small apartment filled with officials and cameras. Local news crews arrived, capturing the contrast between their humble home and the Bradley mansion looming in the background. The prize after taxes came to just over $1 million. Sarah sat quietly through the chaos, answering questions with dignified composure while worry lines deepened around her eyes. She had seen what sudden wealth could do to people, how it could change them in ways money could never fix. But Trey was already dreaming aloud, listing all the things they could finally afford. The neighborhood's reaction was immediate and varied. Mrs. Henderson cried happy tears, hugging them both. Mr. Patterson beamed with grandfatherly pride. The Chen family brought over their special occasion dumplings, refusing payment as always. But there were others, sideways glances, whispered conversations that stopped when they approached, sudden offers of friendship from people who had previously ignored them. That night, after the excitement died down and their small apartment finally emptied of visitors, Sarah found Trey in his room, methodically making lists of everything he planned to buy. "Sweetheart," she started, sitting on his bed, "money can change things, but it doesn't have to change us." But Trey barely heard her, too absorbed in calculating the cost of designer clothes like Brandon's, of gaming systems and luxury phones. The same items he had learned to live without were now tantalizingly within reach. Through his window, the Bradley mansion's lights still blazed, but for the first time they didn't seem impossibly distant. Sarah watched her son with growing concern, recognizing the gleam in his eyes, not just excitement, but something harder, a determination to never feel less than again. She thought of Eleanor's warnings about wealth without wisdom, of James's dreams of helping others rather than accumulating things. But when she tried to share these thoughts, Trey was too busy planning his new life to listen. As she prepared for her night shift, she still had bills to pay until the money came through. Sarah paused in their kitchen, touching the familiar worn spots on their counter, wondering if their simple life of shared struggles and small victories was about to become just a memory. The lottery ticket that had seemed like an answer to their prayers now felt more like a test, one she wasn't sure they were prepared to face. The morning after Trey's lottery win, Victoria Bradley's signature Mercedes glided to a stop in front of the Smiths' apartment building. She emerged immaculately dressed, as if visiting a disadvantaged neighborhood required couture armor. Her heels clicked purposefully on the cracked sidewalk while her personal assistant trailed behind, carrying a gift basket that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. "Oh, Sarah dear," Victoria's voice dripped with practiced concern as she encountered Trey's mother leaving for her diner shift. "We simply must discuss Trey's future. A child with such sudden means requires proper guidance." Her smile never reached her eyes as she pressed her business card into Sarah's hand. "Richard and I would love to have you both for dinner tonight. Say 7 o'clock. Brandon's transformation from tormentor to best friend happened with whiplash speed. The same boy who had mocked Trey's free lunch status now draped an expensive arm around his shoulders in the school hallway. "You're one of us now," he declared loudly, ensuring everyone heard. Let me show you how real money lives. His designer watch glinted as he pulled out the latest iPhone model. First thing we need to do is upgrade your whole everything. Richard Bradley's interest manifested in a series of casual visits to Sarah's workplace. He would sit in her section during lunch rush, leaving enormous tips while discussing investment opportunities. "The boy needs financial guidance," he would say, spreading prospectuses across tables still sticky with syrup. Bradley Development has some excellent opportunities for young investors. Think of Trey's future. The Bradley machine moved with practiced precision. Victoria orchestrated social introductions, arranging playdates with children from appropriate families. Brandon curated Trey's social media presence, teaching him which brands to tag and which people to follow. Richard's business associates miraculously appeared at every turn, each with unique investment opportunities perfect for a young man of means. Private school brochures began arriving daily, all featuring institutions where the Bradley name carried weight. Victoria hosted a small gathering to introduce Trey to the right educational consultants, though Sarah wasn't invited due to her unfortunate work schedule. The message was clear: the Bradleys were positioning themselves as Trey's gateway to high society. "The boy needs proper housing," Richard announced one evening, appearing at their apartment unannounced. He spread glossy photos of luxury condos across their worn kitchen table. "Can't have a millionaire living in." "Well." His gesture encompassed their modest home with elegant disdain. "I have a perfect unit available in one of our premium developments. Brandon would be right next door." Brandon's influence grew daily. He orchestrated Trey's complete makeover, from his haircut at an exclusive salon to his wardrobe from designers Sarah couldn't pronounce. "You can't sit with us looking like," that he would say, eyeing Trey's thrift store clothes with practiced disgust. Shopping trips became lessons in social hierarchy, with Brandon dictating which brands were acceptable and which would mark Trey as new money. Victoria's charity foundation suddenly discovered a pressing interest in education reform. She organized a gala featuring Trey as the keynote speaker, carefully scripting his rags to Rich's story to highlight the Bradleys' mentorship. Photos of Trey and Brandon appeared in local society pages, always with carefully worded captions about the Bradley family's generosity in guiding the lottery winner. The pressure on Sarah intensified. Other mothers at school, following Victoria's lead, began suggesting she step back to allow Trey proper social development. The Bradleys' lawyer appeared with papers for a financial conservatorship, citing Sarah's limited experience with wealth management. Each interaction carried the subtle message that she was now inadequate to guide her own son. Richard's business meetings with Trey grew more frequent, always scheduled during Sarah's work hours. He introduced concepts like offshore accounts and trust structures, speaking quickly and encouraging immediate decisions. "Time is money," he would say, sliding contracts across the table. "You trust us, don't you, son? We're practically family now." Brandon orchestrated Trey's social calendar with military precision, ensuring he was too busy with appropriate activities to spend time with his former friends. Expensive hobbies materialized: polo lessons, sailing clubs, private tennis coaching. Each activity pushed Trey further into the Bradleys' orbit while pulling him away from his roots. Victoria's influence extended to Trey's appearance in public. She coached him on proper posture, acceptable conversation topics, and the importance of being seen at the right events. Reputation is everything, she would remind him while reviewing social media posts. "We must ensure you're presented properly." The transformation they proposed was comprehensive. New phone numbers to avoid unnecessary contacts from his past. Private tutors to correct his public school education. A personal chef to replace Sarah's home-cooked meals. Each suggestion came wrapped in concern for his future, each change designed to remake him in the Bradley image. Trey's metamorphosis began with a haircut at an exclusive salon where Brandon supervised every snip of the scissors. Gone were his mother's careful trims in their kitchen, now expert hands reshaped him, while Victoria Bradley made approving noises from a nearby chair. "The first step in becoming who you're meant to be," she pronounced, examining his reflection with calculating eyes. His old clothes disappeared overnight, replaced by a wardrobe that cost more than Sarah earned in a year. Brandon personally supervised the fitting sessions, teaching Trey the subtle differences between designers. "This is Armani for day wear," he instructed, "Brioni for formal events. Never mix labels that screams new money." Each outfit came with rules about when and where it could be worn, transforming simple acts of dressing into complex social statements. The way Trey carried himself changed first. His shoulders straightened under tailored jackets, his chin lifted with practiced confidence. He learned to examine everything with slight disdain, mastering the art of the raised eyebrow that Brandon's family wielded so effectively. His walk became a studied casualness, carefully hiding the hours spent practicing in front of mirrors. Speech lessons followed, courtesy of Victoria's personal consultant. Trey's natural warmth was replaced by practiced charm, his genuine laugh transformed into a polite chuckle. He learned to say rather instead of pretty to discuss summer as a verb rather than a season. His vocabulary expanded to include words like gauche and nouveau riche, though he used them with careful hesitation, still unsure of their exact meanings. The move to his own luxury apartment marked the physical separation from his old life. The penthouse suite at the Coleman Arms, a Bradley property, of course, became his new kingdom. Professional decorators created a space that looked like a magazine spread, though Trey rarely touched the expensive furniture. His mother's homemade curtains and family photos were quietly removed, deemed unsuitable for his new image. His phone buzzed constantly with social obligations, each carefully orchestrated by Brandon. Charity galas, yacht club events, private club memberships, every invitation designed to cement his place in their world while erasing his connections to the old one. He learned to navigate cheese courses and wine pairings, sparkling cider for now, Brandon assured him, to make small talk about stock portfolios and summer homes. The transformation extended to his school life. Private tutors replaced study sessions with Amy Chen and Marcus Washington. His perfect grades, once earned through late night studying at the kitchen table, now came from expensive coaching and donations to school programs. Brandon taught him the art of appearing effortlessly successful, never letting anyone see the work behind the facade. Food became another battlefield of change. Sarah's carefully packed lunches disappeared, replaced by catered meals that matched Brandon's. He learned to wrinkle his nose at dishes he once loved, to discuss restaurants by their Michelin stars rather than their taste. His mother's spaghetti, once his favorite comfort food, became an embarrassing reminder of life before wealth. His relationship with money underwent the most dramatic transformation. The boy who once counted pennies for lunch now casually signed checks with extra zeros. Brandon taught him the power of conspicuous consumption, leaving excessive tips when people were watching, buying rounds of expensive drinks he wouldn't drink, ensuring his generosity was always publicly displayed. Even his dreams changed shape. The journal filled with plans to help other struggling students gathered dust in a drawer, replaced by investment portfolios and property acquisitions. The Bradleys' vision of success measured in square footage and bank balances slowly overwrote his father's legacy of service and his mother's lessons about true worth. His old friends became strangers, their greetings met with practiced indifference. He passed Mr. Patterson's store without acknowledgement, ignored Mrs. Henderson's cheerful waves, avoided eye contact with the Chen family at their restaurant. Each connection severed was celebrated by his new circle as another step toward becoming who he was meant to be. The most painful transformation was in his relationship with Sarah. Their easy closeness eroded under the weight of his new life. He began scheduling their meetings through his personal assistant, limiting them to brief encounters in public places where his mother's waitress uniform wouldn't attract attention. Their conversations became superficial, focused on his social calendar rather than their shared memories. His bedroom in their old apartment remained frozen in time, like a museum exhibit of a life he was rapidly leaving behind. Sarah kept it exactly as it was, his worn books still on the shelves, his father's journal on the nightstand, the height marks on the doorframe recording his growth. But Trey never stayed there anymore, claiming the air conditioning in his penthouse was better for his allergies. With each passing day, the boy who had helped elderly neighbors with groceries and shared his lunch with hungry classmates faded further away. In his place stood a carefully constructed image of privileged designer clothes, practiced smiles, and calculated charm hiding the increasing emptiness beneath. The transformation seemed complete, but in quiet moments when the lights were off and his phone finally silent, Trey would sometimes touch the worn spot on his bedroom wall, where Eleanor's family photos used to hang, feeling the ghost of who he used to be. Sarah Smith's world crumbled in quiet moments, in the spaces between shifts when her son's absence echoed through their apartment like a physical presence. She still cooked dinner for two each night, wrapping Trey's portion carefully before adding it to the growing collection in the freezer. The ritual helped maintain the fiction that he might come home, might remember the taste of her cooking over whatever gourmet meals his personal chef prepared. Her uniforms grew looser as meals became optional, something to skip when bills needed paying. The diner's regulars noticed her declining health, but knew better than to mention it. They left larger tips, quietly slipped extra food onto plates they sent back uneaten, created excuses to share their meals. Mrs. Henderson started leaving casseroles outside her door, while Mr. Patterson mysteriously found extra groceries that needed to be used today. The hardest moments came during her night shifts at the diner, when she could see Trey's penthouse lights blazing across the street. She would watch shadows move behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching glimpses of her son among his new friends. The distance between them seemed greater than the physical space between buildings, growing wider with each passing day. Eleanor's wedding ring weighed heavier on her finger, a reminder of promises made and values taught. Sarah found herself twisting it during quiet moments, remembering her mother's words about wealth's true meaning. The pawn shop owner had already made several generous offers, but Sarah couldn't bear to part with this last connection to her family's heritage, even as bills mounted and her hours at work were cut. She maintained Trey's room with religious devotion, dusting his books and changing his sheets weekly. His father's journal remained on the nightstand, open to the page where James had written about his dreams for their son's future. The margin notes, written in Eleanor's neat hand, spoke of character's importance over wealth. Sarah would sometimes sit there late at night, reading their words again and again, seeking guidance she could no longer give her son. The Bradleys' influence manifested in 1,000 small humiliations. Victoria's charitable donations of Sarah's old uniforms to church drives, the pointed comments about proper parenting at school events, the way Richard would leave excessive tips at the diner while discussing Trey's need for proper guidance. Each interaction carried the subtle message that she was no longer adequate to mother her own child. Her health began to fail under the constant strain. Chronic headaches developed into persistent migraines, but medical care remained a luxury she couldn't afford. The free clinic where she had once volunteered now had a 3-month waiting list. She learned to work through the pain, hiding her symptoms behind careful makeup and practiced smiles, determined that Trey would never know how much she struggled. The community watched her decline with growing concern. Dr. Martinez offered free consultations disguised as friendly chats over coffee. The Chen family ensured soup deliveries appeared regularly at her door. Even Officer Rivera began parking his patrol car nearby during her late shifts, a silent guardian watching over her walks home. Their kindness made the contrast with her son's new world even more painful. She kept every newspaper clipping about Trey, creating a scrapbook of his transformation. Each photo showed him looking less like her little boy and more like a stranger, his smile becoming practiced, his poses calculated, his eyes holding a coldness she didn't recognize. The society pages chronicled his appearances at charity galas and exclusive events, always with the Bradleys nearby, always without mention of his mother. Parent-teacher conferences became exercises in dignity. She would arrive in her waitress uniform, having rushed from her shift, while Victoria Bradley sat nearby in designer clothes, offering loud opinions about Trey's academic future. Teachers who had once praised her dedication now avoided eye contact, uncertain how to address the mother of their wealthiest student who no longer acknowledged her. The smallest things hurt most, finding his favorite cereal while grocery shopping and remembering she no longer needed to buy it, hearing his favorite song on the diner's radio and realizing he probably considered it embarrassingly common now. Walking past the park, where she had once pushed him on the swings, and seeing it scheduled for demolition by Bradley Development. Her prayers changed from requests for financial security to simple pleas for her son's soul. Each night she would stand at her window, looking toward his penthouse, whispering the same words, "Remember who you are, Trey. Remember who loved you before the money came." The words echoed in their empty apartment, answered only by the distant sounds of parties from across the street. Yet she never stopped being his mother. She worked extra shifts to maintain their apartment, keeping his room ready for a return she increasingly doubted would come. She saved newspaper clippings of science competitions and educational programs, unable to stop planning for his future even as he pulled away. Her love remained unchanged, even as everything else transformed around them. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered in the same examination room where Sarah had once treated patients. Dr. Martinez's hands trembled slightly as he held the test results, his professional demeanor cracking as he faced his former colleague. Stage 3 breast cancer, aggressive, requiring immediate treatment. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on Sarah's face as she absorbed the news. "We need to start chemotherapy immediately," Dr. Martinez said softly, his voice carrying the weight of both doctor and friend. "The survival rates are good if we begin treatment now." He paused, knowing what her next question would be. Even with the sliding scale, the costs will be. He didn't need to finish. They both knew her waitress salary couldn't begin to cover cancer treatment. Sarah's first thought wasn't for herself, but for Trey. Through the clinic window she could see his penthouse gleaming in the distance. The son who now scheduled their meetings through an assistant, who cringed at her waitress uniform, who had traded family dinners for society galas. She made her decision in that moment. He could never know. "Is there any way to keep this confidential?" she asked, straightening her diner uniform. Her shift started in 30 minutes. "My son. He has enough to handle right now." Dr. Martinez understood immediately. He had watched Trey's transformation from afar, seen how wealth had created walls between mother and child. The next weeks became an elaborate dance of secrets. Sarah scheduled chemotherapy sessions between her shifts, telling her employers she needed to care for an elderly neighbor. The diner's owner, Big Mike, saw through the lie but kept her on the schedule, carefully assigning her fewer tables without reducing her pay. Mr. Patterson started stocking ginger tea and crackers, claiming other customers had requested them. The physical changes were harder to hide. Her hair began falling out in clumps, so she bought a wig with her last savings, telling concerned regulars it was just a new style. The constant nausea made eating difficult, but she maintained appearances by moving food around on her plate during staff meals. Mrs. Henderson noticed her growing weakness, but respected her silence, quietly leaving casseroles that Sarah could barely eat. Each chemotherapy session felt like a betrayal of her role as a mother. She would lie in the treatment chair, watching other patients with their family spouses holding hands, children bringing water, friends offering support. Her own son was visible through the hospital window, attending another Bradley charity function in the garden below, unaware his mother fought for her life 12 floors above. The medical bills mounted with terrifying speed. Sarah sold everything of value: her nursing books, her mother's china, the last pieces of jewelry except Eleanor's ring. When that wasn't enough, she started cleaning offices after her diner shifts, ignoring how the chemicals made her nausea worse. The physical toll was visible to everyone except Trey, who rarely looked at her directly during their increasingly brief meetings. One afternoon, Victoria Bradley came to the diner, ordering coffee while Sarah was mid-shift. "You're looking rather Tired, dear, she commented, stirring her untouched drink. But perhaps it's time to consider Trey's best interests. Children of his new status require parents who can maintain certain appearances. The words stung worse than the chemotherapy. The hardest moments came late at night when the pain was too intense for sleep. Sarah would sit in Trey's empty room, holding his old teddy bear, allowing herself to cry only in these private hours. The bear still smelled faintly of the baby shampoo she had used when he was small, when a mother's kiss could heal any hurt. Now her kisses would only leave lipstick marks on his designer clothes. Dr. Martinez arranged for delayed billing and found pharmaceutical programs to reduce medication costs, but the financial burden remained crushing. Sarah started skipping doses of anti-nausea medication, saving them for days when she had to work. She learned to time her vomiting between serving tables, to smile through pain that would have sent others to the emergency room. The community rallied in quiet ways. The Chen family's daughter slipped her extra shifts at their restaurant. Mrs. Henderson's knitting circle mysteriously needed emergency cleaning services, insisting on paying in advance. Officer Rivera started ordering large meals during her shifts, always leaving them barely touched with generous tips. Their kindness made her determined to fight harder, to survive for more than just Trey. But her son's continued absence cut deeper than any surgical procedure. He missed their scheduled dinner again, his assistant citing an urgent social engagement. Through the diner's window, Sarah watched him enter another Bradley gala, laughing at something Brandon said. She touched her wig self-consciously, wondering if he would recognize her at all without it. The final break between mother and son occurred during a Bradley family charity gala, where Trey stood on stage beside Brandon, preparing to announce a major donation to Preston Elementary. Sarah had slipped into the back of the ballroom still wearing her diner uniform, having rushed over during her break just to see her son speak. Her wig was slightly askew from the evening heat, her makeup failing to hide the pallor of her skin. And now Victoria Bradley announced, her voice carrying across the crystal and silk-draped room, our young philanthropist Trey Smith, accompanied by his mentor and guide, Brandon Bradley. The spotlight found Trey, resplendent in a custom-tailored tuxedo, his practice smile perfectly matching Brandon's. Then someone noticed Sarah. "Isn't that your Brandon?" whispered, nodding toward the back of the room. Trey's eyes met his mother's for a brief moment, taking in her worn uniform, her trembling hands, the obvious signs of illness she couldn't quite hide. In that split second, he made a choice that would haunt him later. "Simply one of our serving staff," he replied loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Though I believe she's supposed to be working, not watching the entertainment," the words carried across the suddenly silent room. Sarah stood frozen, the weight of her son's rejection heavier than any chemotherapy treatment. Victoria's smile widened fractionally as she gestured for security. "Please escort the help back to their appropriate areas," she commanded. Sarah didn't resist as two guards gently but firmly led her out, her legs barely supporting her. Through the doors, she heard Trey's speech continue without hesitation, announcing a donation to replace the school's outdated facilities. The next morning, a formal letter arrived from Trey's lawyers. All future communication would need to go through proper channels. His assistant would schedule monthly meetings at appropriate venues. The letter cited his new social responsibilities and the need to maintain proper appearances. It was signed regards, Trey Smith, not love or even your son. Sarah placed the letter in Eleanor's recipe box, alongside other precious papers: Trey's birth certificate, James's last letter, her mother's final birthday card. Her hands shook as she closed the lid, but she didn't cry. There were customers waiting at the diner, and tears wouldn't pay for her next chemotherapy session. The separation became physical as well as emotional. Trey moved his few remaining possessions from their apartment, sending professional movers rather than coming himself. They packed everything except the family photos, which were deemed unsuitable for his new image. Sarah watched from the window as James's old briefcase and Eleanor's handmade quilt disappeared into the moving van. At school, Trey began referring to himself as a self-made millionaire, never mentioning the mother who had worked 3 jobs to keep him fed. His new biography, carefully crafted by the Bradleys' PR team, spoke of humble beginnings overcome through determination. Without acknowledging the sacrifices that had gotten him to the lottery win, Brandon orchestrated Trey's complete social transformation. His phone number changed, his email account was replaced, his social media scrubbed of any references to his past. Old friends found themselves blocked, their messages returned unread. The only connections allowed were those approved by the Bradley family. The community watched in silent disapproval as Trey's rejection extended beyond his mother. He stopped acknowledging Mr. Patterson's greetings, ignored Mrs. Henderson's waves, walked past the Chen family restaurant as if it were invisible. Each snub felt like a personal betrayal to those who had helped raise him. The final blow came during a parent-teacher conference. Sarah arrived to find the meeting already in progress, Victoria Bradley sitting in the parents' chair, while Trey reviewed his academic progress with the teachers. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Victoria said smoothly when Sarah entered. "Trey's educational decisions are now handled by our family's educational consultant." That night, Sarah sat in Trey's empty room for hours, holding his old teddy bear. The height marks on the doorframe, the worn spot on the carpet where he used to study, the collection of rocks he'd gathered on walks with Eleanor, every memory seemed to mock her current reality. Outside, she could hear laughter from another Bradley party, her son's voice among them. The diner's regular customers created a protective circle around Sarah, intercepting Trey when he rarely came in with his new friends. They would seat him far from his mother's section, trying to spare her the pain of serving her own son. Big Mike started asking other waitresses to cover Trey's table, making excuses about section rotation. Sarah maintained her dignity through it all. She continued working her shifts, continued making Trey's favorite meals that no one ate, continued keeping his room ready for a return she no longer expected. Her love remained unchanged, even as her son became a stranger in designer clothes who looked through her as if she were invisible. Richard Bradley's master plan unfolded with the precision of a chess grandmaster moving pieces across the board. Each meeting with Trey happened during Sarah's work hours, in his wood-paneled office filled with leather-bound books and the scent of old money. The documents appeared casually, slipped between conversations about social status and proper investments. Just a few standard forms, Richard would say, sliding papers across his mahogany desk while Brandon distracted Trey with stories about their upcoming yacht club membership. "Nothing to worry about, son. We're practically family now." The contracts, thick with legal jargon and complex clauses, received only cursory glances before Trey's signature transformed them into binding agreements. Victoria orchestrated the social aspect of their financial web, hosting elaborate dinner parties where Trey was subtly pressured to contribute to various exclusive investment opportunities. "All the right people are involved," she would murmur, as other guests nodded approvingly. "You don't want to be left out of this one, dear." Each event ended with another signature, another portion of his fortune redirected into Bradley-controlled accounts. The transformation of Trey's trust fund happened in careful stages. First came the restructuring for tax purposes, moving assets through a maze of shell companies. Brandon would casually mention how his father had saved their family millions through similar arrangements. The documents requiring Trey's signature grew more complex, but his understanding of them remained superficial. Weekly investment meetings became mandatory, scheduled during Sarah's diner shifts to ensure she couldn't intervene. Richard presented elaborate charts and graphs, speaking quickly about market trends and investment strategies, while his lawyers quietly added riders to existing contracts. Trey nodded along, eager to prove his sophistication, never noticing how each decision further entangled his assets with Bradley Development. The family's influence extended to Trey's legal representation. His court-appointed financial advisor was gradually pushed aside, replaced by Bradley-approved lawyers who answered to Richard rather than their nominal client. The concerns about conflict of interest were dismissed with practiced ease. "We're all working toward the same goal," Richard assured during board meetings where Trey sat, playing with his phone while adults decided his financial future. Brandon's role proved crucial in the manipulation. He would casually mention investment opportunities during their gaming sessions, making Trey feel childish for questioning complex financial decisions. "This is how real money works," he would say, his contempt for hesitation clear. "Unless you want to go back to counting pennies like your mother." Victoria's Charity Foundation became another tool for accessing Trey's funds. She orchestrated elaborate fundraisers where his donations were expected, each contribution carefully structured to benefit Bradley-controlled entities. The press releases praised his generosity while hiding the fact that his money was essentially being transferred from one Bradley pocket to another. The paperwork arrived with increasing frequency: investment agreements, property transfers, power of attorney forms. Each document was presented as routine, necessary for Trey's entry into high society. The Bradleys' lawyer would appear at social functions, catching Trey between conversations for just a quick signature on papers he never fully read. Richard's business associates played their parts perfectly, treating Trey like an equal while steering his fortune into predetermined channels. They created an illusion of financial sophistication around him, praising his investment acumen while systematically dismantling his independence. Board meetings became exercises in carefully orchestrated manipulation, with decisions made long before Trey entered the room. The pressure to maintain appearances drove Trey deeper into their web. Expensive cars, designer wardrobes, and luxury vacations drained his accessible funds, making him increasingly dependent on the Bradleys' financial guidance. Each extravagance was encouraged, pushing him toward a lifestyle he couldn't sustain without their continued involvement. Victoria's social calendar ensured Trey remained too busy to examine his financial situation closely. Between charity galas, social obligations, and Brandon's carefully planned activities, he barely had time to glance at the monthly statements that showed his fortune slowly disappearing into Bradley-controlled investments. By the time the first red flags appeared — bounced checks, declined cards, unexpected fees — Trey was too deeply enmeshed to question the Bradleys' explanations. Richard smoothly offered bridge loans and credit extensions, each one securing another piece of control over the diminishing trust fund. The documents Trey signed to access emergency funds contained clauses that would prove devastating later. Mrs. Henderson discovered the first piece of Eleanor's puzzle while helping Sarah clean out their building storage unit. Behind a stack of old textbooks lay a leather-bound diary, its pages filled with Eleanor's precise handwriting. The discovery might have seemed insignificant if not for the name that appeared repeatedly throughout its pages — Bradley. Richard Bradley wasn't always wealthy, Eleanor had written. "I remember when he came to James seeking a loan for his first property development. James believed in helping others start their dreams. The money was never repaid." The entries continued, documenting years of observations about the Bradley family's rise to power, each page revealing a pattern of manipulation and betrayal. Sarah's hands trembled as she read her mother's words. Eleanor, it seemed, had been keeping careful records of the Bradleys' business practices long before her death. There were newspaper clippings, bank statements, and correspondence that painted a disturbing picture of how the family had built their empire on broken promises and ruined lives. More evidence emerged from unexpected places. Mr. Patterson found a box of old records in his store's basement, documentation of small businesses forced out by Bradley Development's aggressive tactics. Eleanor had collected their stories, recording dates, amounts, and the human cost of each urban renewal project. The most damning evidence came from Eleanor's old teaching colleagues. She had maintained a network of observers, each contributing pieces to a larger puzzle. School board minutes showing suspicious donations coinciding with zoning changes. Property records revealing how families were systematically pushed out of their neighborhoods. Even James's death had a connection. He had been preparing to expose Bradley Development's manipulation of school district funding. "Watch them closely," Eleanor had written in her final entry, dated just days before her death. "They see people as pieces on a chessboard, moving them according to their own rules. Sarah and Trey must be protected from their influence." The warning came too late for Trey, but perhaps not for his future. Victoria Bradley's charity work received particular attention in Eleanor's notes. Detailed records showed how donations were recycled through shell companies, creating an illusion of philanthropy while actually funneling money back to Bradley Enterprises. Eleanor had tracked every gala, every fundraiser, documenting the gap between public promises and private actions. The diary contained maps of the neighborhood marked with Bradley Development's expansion plans, many implemented years after Eleanor's observations. She had predicted exactly how they would target vulnerable properties, pressure small business owners, and manipulate property values. Each strategy currently being used against Sarah and Trey had been forewarned in her careful notes. Brandon's father appeared frequently in Eleanor's records, his rise from struggling realtor to property mogul documented through a series of questionable transactions. Richard Bradley attended every PTA meeting. She wrote, "Not out of interest in education, but scanning for properties owned by struggling families. He could smell financial desperation like a shark senses blood." Letters between Eleanor and other teachers revealed a coordinated effort to protect students from the Bradleys' influence. They had created a support network for families facing eviction, found alternative spaces for displaced businesses, and maintained records of every broken promise and forced relocation. The most personal evidence was a letter Eleanor had written to Trey, sealed and dated for his 18th birthday. "My dearest grandson." It began, "By the time you read this, you may have already encountered the Bradley family's influence. Remember that true wealth lies not in bank accounts, but in how we treat others. Your father understood this. I pray you will too." Hidden behind loose baseboards in Eleanor's old apartment, Mrs. Henderson discovered more documents, photographs of handshake deals never honored, copies of contracts with hidden clauses, and a detailed account of how Bradley Development had systematically taken control of the neighborhood. Sarah read through her mother's records with growing understanding. Eleanor hadn't been just a retired teacher, she'd been a meticulous chronicler of corruption, building a case that could expose the Bradleys' entire empire. Her death had interrupted the investigation, but she'd left enough breadcrumbs for others to follow. The final piece of evidence was a safety deposit box key, taped to the last page of the diary with a simple note for when the truth becomes necessary. Sarah held the key, feeling its weight, understanding that her mother had left them more than just memories, she'd left them ammunition. The eviction notice arrived on the same morning. Sarah found herself too weak to finish her diner shift. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the coffee pot, and the regular customers watched in silent concern as she struggled to maintain her balance. The paper from Bradley Development announced their building's imminent demolition, giving tenants 30 days to vacate. The timing couldn't have been worse. Medical bills had already consumed her savings, forcing her to choose between chemotherapy and rent. The diner's owner, Big Mike, had found her sleeping in her car behind the restaurant one night after a late shift. He didn't say anything, just left the back door unlocked and turned a blind eye to her using the staff room shower before opening time. Her carefully maintained appearance began to crack. The wig couldn't quite hide the dramatic weight loss, and her diner uniform hung loose despite multiple alterations. Regular customers noticed how she would grip tables for support, how her breaks grew longer as she fought waves of nausea in the bathroom. They created an informal support system, Mrs. Chen bringing soup, Mr. Patterson accidentally ordering too much bread, Officer Rivera insisting she rest in his patrol car during her breaks. The worst moments came during her chemotherapy sessions, which she now attended alone in the same hospital where she'd once been a respected nurse. Former colleagues passed by without recognition, while others averted their eyes, uncomfortable with her descent from medical professional to charity case. She would sit in the treatment chair, watching Trey's penthouse through the window, wondering if he ever looked down and noticed his mother's car parked in the hospital lot. Her living situation deteriorated rapidly. Unable to afford both rent and medical treatment, Sarah began spending nights in her car, parking in different locations to avoid attention. She kept her few remaining possessions in the diner's storage room, maintaining a small suitcase of uniforms in her trunk. The local gym's monthly membership fee became a worthwhile expense for access to showers and a warm place during cold mornings. The community's response to her situation was both heartbreaking and uplifting. Mrs. Henderson secretly collected donations from their old neighbors, always finding ways to help that preserved Sarah's dignity. A basket of extra cleaning supplies appeared in the diner's break room. Gift cards for groceries were accidentally left at her tables. Each small kindness brought tears she couldn't afford to shed. Dr. Martinez arranged for delayed billing and found pharmaceutical programs to reduce medication costs, but the financial burden remained crushing. Sarah started skipping doses of pain medication, saving them for days when work was unavoidable. She learned to time her symptoms around her shifts to smile through pain that would have sent others to the emergency room. The physical toll became impossible to hide. During one lunch rush, she collapsed while carrying plates, sending china shattering across the floor. Big Mike carried her to his office, ignoring her weak protests about finishing her shift. The regular customers quietly cleaned up the mess, leaving extra tips that would cover the broken dishes. Her determination to maintain appearances for Trey's sake became an increasingly difficult performance. She kept 3 pressed uniforms in her car, changed in public restrooms, and applied makeup in rearview mirrors to hide the dark circles under her eyes. During their increasingly rare scheduled meetings, she would arrive early to ensure she looked presentable, though Trey rarely looked directly at her anymore. The final indignity came when Victoria Bradley visited the diner, ostentatiously leaving pamphlets for homeless shelters on her table. "We're concerned about the establishment's hygiene standards," she announced loudly, eyeing Sarah's trembling hands. But the other customers rallied immediately, Mrs. Chen loudly praising Sarah's cleanliness, Officer Rivera making a show of inspecting and approving the premises. Sarah's world shrank to a series of careful calculations. Each day became a puzzle of managing symptoms, stretching resources, and maintaining the facade of normalcy. She kept careful track of safe parking spots, public restrooms, and places she could rest briefly without drawing attention. The library became a sanctuary during her off hours, providing warmth and quiet corners where she could recover between shifts. The hardest part was maintaining her role as a mother, even as her son slipped further away. She still bought small gifts she couldn't afford, leaving them with his doorman. She kept his favorite childhood books in her car, reading them late at night when pain kept her awake. Every morning she parked within view of his penthouse, watching him leave for school in his chauffeured car, making sure he looked healthy and well cared for. Through it all, she never stopped being a mother. Even living in her car, she kept a small photo album of Trey's childhood, carefully protected in a waterproof bag. She maintained a journal of things she wanted to tell him, hopes and memories and pieces of advice she could no longer share in person. Each entry began "My dearest son" and ended with "I love you always," though the pages remained unread. The first crack in Trey's carefully constructed new world appeared during a late-night party at the Bradley mansion. He had stepped away to answer a phone call when he overheard Brandon and Richard Bradley speaking in the study, their voices carrying through the partially open door. "The Smith boy is proving more useful than expected," Richard was saying, swirling expensive scotch in a crystal glass. "His trust fund will cover the downtown development project nicely." Brandon's response chilled Trey to his core. "He's so desperate to belong, he doesn't even read what he signs anymore. Mother says he's the perfect example of how new money needs proper guidance." Their laughter, cultured and cruel, echoed in Trey's ears long after he had pretended not to hear. Small observations began to accumulate. He noticed how Brandon's friendship came with constant reminders of their social differences, subtle jabs wrapped in helpful advice. The way Victoria's smile never quite reached her eyes when she called him dear. How Richard's investment meetings always ended with unexplained transfers from Trey's accounts to Bradley-controlled entities. During a charity gala, Trey caught his reflection in a gilded mirror and barely recognized himself. His designer suit felt like a costume, his practiced smile a mask. In that moment, he remembered how his mother used to say that true character shows in how you treat those who can't help you. He had watched Brandon mock a waitress earlier that evening, a woman about his mother's age, working a double shift to support her family. The doubts grew stronger during a school board meeting where Brandon casually mentioned plans to eliminate the free lunch program Trey had once depended on. Those people need to learn self-reliance, Brandon declared, while their classmates nodded in agreement. Trey's stomach churned, remembering how that program had kept him fed during their hardest times. Late one night, unable to sleep in his luxury penthouse, Trey found himself reviewing old photographs on his phone, pictures he hadn't had the heart to delete. Images of birthday celebrations with homemade cakes, Christmas mornings with modest but thoughtful gifts, family dinners where love made up for what they lacked in material wealth. The contrast with his current life, surrounded by expensive things but increasingly empty of genuine connections, became painfully clear. He began noticing changes in his mother during their brief, scheduled meetings. Her weight loss, poorly disguised by carefully pressed uniforms. The tremor in her hands that she tried to hide. The way she seemed to gather her strength before standing, as though every movement required careful calculation. But whenever he started to ask, Brandon would appear with some urgent social obligation, whisking him away from uncomfortable questions. The community's cold treatment of him started to make sense in a new light. Mr. Patterson's disappointed head shake when Trey passed his store, Mrs. Henderson's sad eyes when she saw him with the Bradleys, the way his old neighbors turned away not out of jealousy, he realized, but disappointment in what he had become. During a Bradley business dinner, Trey overheard Victoria discussing his mother with other society women. The woman clearly can't take care of herself, let alone influence someone of Trey's new status, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. Really, it's kinder to help him make a clean break, the others murmured in agreement, while Trey sat frozen, his expensive meal turning to ash in his mouth. He began secretly watching his mother from his penthouse window. He saw her arriving at the diner for early morning shifts, noticed how she seemed to move more slowly each day. Once he spotted her sleeping in her car behind the restaurant, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. While he lived in luxury, his mother was homeless. Questions about his finances met with smooth deflections from Richard Bradley. "Leave the complex details to us," he would say, patting Trey's shoulder with patronizing affection. "Focus on enjoying your new lifestyle." But Trey couldn't help noticing how his bank statements grew thinner, while Bradley Development announced new projects with familiar-looking funding structures. The final wake-up call came during a midnight drive with Brandon, who had had too much to drink at a party. "You know what's funny?" Brandon slurred, his usual polish slipping. "Everyone thinks you're this amazing success story, but really you're just our most successful project yet. Dad says by the time you figure it out, there won't be anything left to figure out." He laughed, not noticing how Trey's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That night, Trey lay awake in his penthouse, surrounded by expensive furnishings that suddenly felt like props in an elaborate play. He thought about his father's journal, still sitting in his old room, filled with dreams of helping others rather than accumulating wealth. He remembered Eleanor's lessons about the true meaning of success. For the first time since winning the lottery, he felt truly poor. The Bradley family's control over Trey's life tightened like a noose, methodically strangling every remaining connection to his past. Richard Bradley's legal team worked overtime, creating an intricate web of financial dependencies disguised as investment opportunities. Each document signed transferred more control to Bradley Development through a maze of subsidiaries and shell companies. Victoria orchestrated the social isolation with surgical precision. She hosted exclusive events where Trey's attendance was mandatory, always scheduled to conflict with his mother's attempts to arrange meetings. "Darling, you simply must attend the governor's reception," she would insist, knowing Sarah had requested dinner that evening. "These connections are crucial for your future." Brandon's role evolved from friend to handler, monitoring Trey's every movement. His constant presence ensured that any interaction with undesirable elements from Trey's past could be quickly interrupted. Phone calls were screened, emails filtered, and social media carefully curated to maintain the image they had created. The Bradleys' influence extended to Trey's education. Expensive tutors replaced his regular teachers, each one reporting directly to Victoria. His class schedule was reorganized to separate him from former friends, especially Amy Chen and Marcus Washington, whose parents had started asking uncomfortable questions about his trust fund management. Richard's control over Trey's finances reached new levels of sophistication. Bank accounts were restructured, assets were transferred to more secure investments, and access to funds became increasingly restricted. "It's for your own protection," Richard would explain, sliding new papers across his desk. "Young people often make impulsive decisions with money." The physical isolation became complete when Bradley Development announced plans to demolish Trey's old apartment building. The eviction notices went out to all tenants, including Sarah, with Victoria chairing the neighborhood improvement committee that approved the project. The same building where Trey had grown up would become another luxury development. Media coverage was carefully managed through Bradley-owned publications. Stories about Trey portrayed him as a success story of proper mentorship, with the Bradleys cast as benevolent guides, helping a lottery winner avoid the usual pitfalls of sudden wealth. Any attempts by Sarah or community members to contact journalists were quietly suppressed. Legal pressure mounted on multiple fronts. Bradley's lawyers filed motions to establish formal guardianship over Trey's trust fund, citing his age and need for professional management. They initiated proceedings to restrict Sarah's access to her son, presenting evidence of her unstable living situation without mentioning their role in creating it. The community watched helplessly as Bradley Development systematically acquired local properties. Mr. Patterson received notice that his store's lease wouldn't be renewed. The Chen family's restaurant faced sudden health code inspections. Mrs. Henderson's apartment building was scheduled for urgent renovations requiring tenant relocation. Victoria's charity foundation became a weapon of social control. Donations were strategically withheld from organizations that maintained connections with Sarah. Community programs that had once helped the Smith family found their funding mysteriously cut, replaced by Bradley-approved initiatives that served their interests. Brandon's social network became Trey's prison. Every interaction was monitored, every conversation steered toward approved topics. Former friends found themselves excluded from events, their invitations lost, their messages unanswered. The isolation was complete, disguised as social advancement. School administrators, mindful of Bradley donations, began treating Trey differently. His tardiness was overlooked, his absences excused without question, his academic performance managed to maintain appropriate appearances. Teachers who had once praised his hard work now graded him according to expectations rather than merit. The psychological manipulation intensified. Victoria arranged for a therapist carefully selected and well paid to reinforce their narrative about Trey's need to move beyond his humble beginnings. Regular sessions focused on adapting to his new social position rather than addressing his growing isolation and doubt. Richard's business associates treated Trey as a puppet, praising his investment decisions while actually implementing Bradley Development's agenda. Board meetings became exercises in controlled theater, with Trey's role reduced to nodding and signing documents he barely understood. The final phase of control targeted Trey's identity itself. His speech patterns were corrected to eliminate traces of his background, his mannerisms refined to match Brandon's, his entire personality reshaped to fit the Bradley mold. Even his memories were subject to revision, with Victoria subtly rewriting the narrative of his past to minimize Sarah's role and emphasize their saving influence. The resistance began in the unlikely setting of Patterson's Market's basement, where Amy Chen spread Eleanor's diary across a makeshift table made from old produce crates. Marcus Washington, whose father's janitorial position at Preston Elementary gave him access after hours, contributed a stack of financial documents found in discarded files. Mrs. Henderson brought Sarah's medical records, revealing the devastating timeline of her untreated illness. "Look at these dates," Amy said, her finger tracing entries in Eleanor's diary. "The Bradleys started targeting Trey before he even won the lottery. They've done this before." She pulled out newspaper clippings Eleanor had collected, showing a pattern of similar cases, suddenly wealthy individuals who mysteriously lost everything to Bradley development projects. The investigation expanded through the community's invisible network. The Chen family's restaurant became an after-hours command center, with Mrs. Chen's delivery drivers reporting Bradley family movements. Mr. Washington's janitorial crew documented late-night meetings at the school, photographing documents left carelessly in waste baskets. Officer Rivera contributed police reports that never made official files, complaints against Bradley development that mysteriously disappeared, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories. His patrol car became a mobile surveillance unit, tracking the comings and goings at Bradley properties while maintaining his regular routes. The local librarian, Miss Martinez, discovered crucial evidence in archived town records. Property transfers, zoning changes, and business licenses told a story of systematic community dismantling. Each Bradley development improvement project had left a trail of displaced families and shuttered businesses. Dr. Martinez's medical office became an information clearinghouse. His patients, representing every level of the community, shared pieces of the puzzle. House cleaners reported overheard conversations, gardeners noticed suspicious meetings, and service workers contributed their observations of the Bradleys' operation. Amy's technical skills proved invaluable. She created a secure digital database of evidence, cross-referencing dates and events to reveal patterns. Her younger brother, a computer enthusiast, managed to access public records that showed the complex web of Bradley-owned shell companies. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Brandon's personal driver, tired of witnessing the family's cruelty, began recording conversations during drives. The casual discussions of manipulation and fraud, spoken freely in what they thought was private space, provided damning evidence of their schemes. Mrs. Henderson organized a network of elderly residents whose presence in the community was often overlooked. They watched from their windows, documented suspicious activities, and maintained detailed logs of Bradley Development's operations. Their age and apparent harmlessness made them invisible to the family's security measures. The Chen family's delivery service became an intelligence network. Drivers noted which lawyers visited Bradley offices, photographed license plates, and tracked the movement of documents between buildings. Every delivery to the Bradley mansion was an opportunity to gather information. Marcus discovered a pattern in the school's financial records. Bradley donations always preceded controversial board decisions, with funds flowing through a complex network of parent organizations and educational foundations. Each contribution came with hidden strings that pulled the school further under their control. The investigation received unexpected support from former Bradley employees. Housekeepers, gardeners, and maintenance workers came forward with stories of document shredding, late-night meetings, and suspicious financial activities. Their testimonies, carefully documented by Amy, revealed the inner workings of the Bradley empire. Young people proved especially effective investigators. Children of service workers, ignored by the wealthy as part of the background, observed and reported countless details. They played near Bradley properties, photographed visitors with their phones, and compiled social media posts that contradicted official narratives. The evidence mounted in encrypted files and hidden notebooks. Financial records showed how Bradley Development systematically drained Trey's trust fund through seemingly legitimate investments. Social calendars revealed their calculated isolation tactics. Email threads exposed their manipulation of local media and government officials. As the investigation grew, the community's determination strengthened. Each new piece of evidence confirmed Eleanor's warnings and validated their suspicions. They worked quietly, carefully building their case while appearing to accept the Bradleys' dominance. Their weapons were not money or power, but truth meticulously documented and preserved. The annual Preston Elementary Scholarship fundraiser transformed the school gymnasium into an elegant event space, with crystal chandeliers hanging where basketball hoops usually dominated. Victoria Bradley stood at the podium, announcing another generous donation from their foundation, while Sarah quietly served Hors d'oeuvres in her catering uniform. Her wig was carefully adjusted, her makeup hiding the pallor of her skin, but nothing could disguise the trembling of her hands. Trey stood beside Brandon on the stage, wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than Sarah's monthly medical bills. He was scheduled to announce a new educational initiative, carefully scripted by the Bradleys' PR team. Through the crowd, his eyes briefly met his mother's, but he quickly looked away, focusing on the index cards in his hands. The first sign something was wrong came when Sarah stumbled slightly, steadying herself against a wall. Mrs. Henderson, attending as a former teacher, noticed her shallow breathing and unusually pale complexion. Several guests complained about slow service, unaware that each step was a battle against pain and exhaustion. And now, Victoria announced, her voice carrying across the room, our young philanthropist will share exciting news about the future of Preston Elementary. Trey stepped forward, Brandon's hand firmly on his shoulder. At that moment, a crash echoed through the hall as Sarah's serving tray hit the floor. She tried to catch herself, but her legs gave way. The room spun as she collapsed, her wig sliding slightly to reveal the effects of chemotherapy. Glasses shattered around her, punch staining her uniform like blood. The crowd gasped, conversations stopping mid-sentence as Sarah Smith, former nurse and mother of their young philanthropist, lay unconscious on the gymnasium floor. Dr. Martinez pushed through the crowd, his retired medical instincts taking over. She needs immediate medical attention, he announced, checking her vital signs. The cancer has progressed significantly. The word cancer echoed in the sudden silence. Trey stood frozen on stage, the carefully prepared speech falling from his hands. Victoria attempted to maintain control. Please, let's give the server some privacy, she said smoothly. The catering company should have better health screening procedures, but Mrs. Henderson was already announcing to the room that this wasn't just a server, this was Sarah Smith, mother of the boy standing speechless on their stage. The photographers present for the fundraiser captured everything: Sarah's collapsed form, Trey's shocked expression, the Bradley family's obvious discomfort. Brandon tried to pull Trey away, but for once his influence faltered. Trey finally moved, not toward the exit as Brandon urged, but toward his mother's unconscious form. Mom, his voice cracked, sounding suddenly young and scared. Mom, please wake up. The facade of the sophisticated young millionaire vanished, replaced by a terrified child watching his mother fight for life on a polished gymnasium floor. Victoria's attempts to maintain the event's momentum died as Trey knelt beside Sarah, heedless of his expensive suit. The truth spilled out in urgent whispers through the crowd. Sarah's cancer diagnosis, her homelessness, her continued work despite deteriorating health, all while her son lived in luxury under Bradley's supervision. Amy Chen's father announced that their restaurant had been secretly providing meals. Mr. Patterson revealed how she slept in her car between shifts. Each disclosure painted a devastating picture of sacrifice and suffering. Emergency responders arrived to find a scene very different from the elegant fundraiser planned. Sarah was lifted onto a stretcher, oxygen mask covering her face, while Trey held her hand, publicly acknowledging their relationship for the first time in months. Victoria's attempts to separate them died under the collective glare of the community. "She needs immediate hospitalization," Dr. Martinez informed the paramedics. "Stage 4 cancer, untreated due to financial constraints." He looked pointedly at Trey, whose face showed the dawning horror of understanding. All the money he'd poured into Bradley investments while his mother skipped meals to afford basic medication. As they wheeled Sarah out, her worn purse fell open, spilling its contents. Among the items scattered across the floor were carefully preserved newspaper clippings of Trey's social events, a half-empty bottle of pain pills, and a notebook filled with letters to her son, each one written but never delivered. Mrs. Henderson gathered them up, reading aloud the date of the first entry the day Trey had moved out. The community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Offers of help poured in: medical connections, legal assistance, places to stay. The Bradleys' influence cracked against the wall of collective outrage. Even their usual supporters couldn't ignore the stark contrast between Trey's lavish lifestyle and his mother's desperate situation. Brandon Bradley's carefully constructed world began to unravel with a single forgotten laptop, left open during the chaos of Sarah's collapse at the fundraiser. Amy Chen, helping to clean up the gymnasium, discovered it still logged into his private accounts. What she found shattered any remaining illusions about the Bradley family's mentorship of Trey. Video diaries, meticulously dated and organized, revealed Brandon's calculated manipulation from the beginning. Day 1 of the Smith project, Brandon's recorded voice announced from the screen. "Father says the lottery winner will be perfect for our downtown development funding. Just need to isolate him from negative influences, especially the mother." Each entry documented their systematic destruction of Trey's family bonds and financial independence. The evidence spread like wildfire through the community. Brandon's emails to his father outlined their strategy. Trey signed the transfer documents today. He didn't even read page 6, where control of the trust transfers to our shell company. "These scholarship kids are so desperate to belong, they'll sign anything." Screenshots circulated showing how they had gradually drained Trey's trust fund through a maze of fake investments. Victoria's Charity Foundation records, accessed through Mrs. Chen's catering staff, exposed an elaborate money laundering scheme. Each of Trey's philanthropic donations had been carefully structured to flow back into Bradley development projects. The foundation's books revealed how they had used his fortune to finance their own expansion while maintaining a facade of community service. Richard Bradley's business documents, photographed by the night cleaning crew, showed detailed plans for using Trey's assets to acquire properties throughout the neighborhood. Maps marked future development sites, including the apartment building where Sarah now lay homeless and sick. Profit projections calculated the value of destroying entire communities for luxury developments. The most damning evidence came from Brandon's social media planning documents. Every photo op, every charitable gesture, every friendship had been choreographed to create an image that served the Bradleys' purposes. Private messages revealed how he mocked Trey behind his back, calling him their perfect puppet and joking about his desperation to belong. Security camera footage from the Bradley mansion, obtained by their former security chief who had grown disgusted with their behavior, caught countless incriminating conversations. Richard Bradley discussing how to pressure Sarah out of her apartment, with Victoria planning ways to undermine her son's confidence. Brandon rehearsing his manipulative tactics before each interaction with Trey. Financial records, pieced together by Amy's computer skills, traced the complex web of transactions designed to strip Trey of his fortune. Each investment opportunity, each business venture, each charitable donation had been structured to fail, with assets flowing back to Bradley-controlled entities through hidden channels. The evidence reached beyond Trey's case. Eleanor's diary connected to other families the Bradleys had destroyed, other fortunes they had stolen through similar schemes. Their pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals with sudden wealth, isolating them from support systems, and systematically draining their resources emerged with devastating clarity. Brandon's private journal, found in his school locker by Marcus Washington's father, revealed the calculated nature of their friendship. It's almost entertaining. One entry read, "Watching him try so hard to fit in. He actually believes we consider him an equal. Father says the best marks are the ones who think they're part of the family." Legal documents, analyzed by attorneys who offered their services pro bono, exposed the Bradleys' manipulation of the court system. They had planted their own people in key positions, ensuring that any challenges to their control of Trey's trust would be quickly dismissed. Even his court-appointed financial advisor had been secretly on their payroll. Victoria's social calendar, obtained from her personal assistant who had finally had enough, showed how every event had been designed to further isolate Trey from his support system. Each gathering, each introduction, each coincidental meeting had been planned to deepen his dependence on the Bradley family while cutting ties to his past. The community's evidence gathering accelerated. Store owners provided security footage showing Bradley associates threatening local businesses. Teachers came forward with records of how the family had manipulated school policies. Former employees shared stories of document shredding parties and midnight meetings where they planned their next target. As the evidence mounted, the Bradleys' carefully maintained image crumbled. Their attempts at damage control only provided more proof of their manipulation. Each denial was met with another document, another recording, another witness stepping forward to expose their true nature. The first court hearing took place in a packed courtroom, with Sarah attending from a wheelchair, still weak from her hospitalization. The Bradley family arrived in force, their legal team filling one side of the room with expensive suits and leather briefcases. On the other side sat the community Mr. Patterson, the Chen family, Mrs. Henderson, and dozens of others who had contributed to building the case against the Bradleys. David Chen, Amy's uncle and a junior attorney at a small local firm, stood to present their case. His modest appearance contrasted sharply with the Bradleys' polished legal team, but his voice carried the strength of community support as he outlined their evidence. "Your Honor, what we have here is not just financial fraud, but the systematic destruction of a family for profit." The evidence unfolded like chapters in a tragic novel. Financial records showed how the Bradleys had gradually drained Trey's trust fund through a complex web of fake investments. Brandon's video diaries revealed their calculated manipulation of a vulnerable child. Victoria's Charity Foundation documents exposed how they had used Trey's donations to further their own interests while maintaining a facade of philanthropy. Richard Bradley's composure cracked when David played the security footage from their mansion, capturing private conversations about their Smith project. The court watched in silence as the family plotted to separate mother and son, discussed ways to pressure Sarah out of her home, and laughed about Trey's desperate attempts to belong in their world. Sarah's testimony brought many in the courtroom to tears. She described working through chemotherapy to maintain appearances, sleeping in her car to afford medication, watching her son slip away under Bradley influence. Her voice trembled but remained strong as she explained how she had chosen silence to protect Trey's chance at a better life, even as that choice destroyed her own. The community's evidence proved overwhelming. Mrs. Henderson presented Eleanor's diary, its pages documenting years of Bradley manipulation. Mr. Patterson provided records of similar schemes against other families. The Chen family's restaurant staff testified about overhearing Bradley associates planning their takeover of local businesses. Brandon's attempt to defend himself backfired spectacularly. Under cross-examination, his carefully practiced charm crumbled. He couldn't explain away his recorded boasts about manipulating Trey, his mocking messages to friends about their perfect puppet, or the detailed plans found on his laptop for systematically destroying Trey's family bonds. Victoria's testimony revealed more than she intended. Her attempts to justify their actions as mentoring a child unused to wealth fell apart when confronted with evidence of how they had orchestrated Sarah's homelessness. Her mask of concerned philanthropy shattered when David produced emails showing how she had blocked Sarah's attempts to contact her son. The breakthrough came when Richard's former secretary took the stand. She provided years of documentation showing how Bradley Development had targeted suddenly wealthy individuals, isolated them from support systems, and systematically stripped them of their assets. Trey's case wasn't unique, it was just the first time they had been caught. The judge's questioning grew increasingly sharp as the evidence mounted. The Bradleys' legal team's attempts to dismiss the case as a misunderstanding between business partners crumbled against the weight of documented manipulation. Their usual tactics of delays and procedural obstacles failed against the community's united testimony. Local media, finally free from Bradley influence, covered every moment of the trial. The contrast between Sarah's quiet dignity and the Bradleys' crumbling facade made compelling headlines. Each day brought new revelations, new witnesses, new evidence of how deeply their corruption had penetrated the community. Trey's testimony proved the most powerful. Standing before the court, he described his transformation from a loved child to a manipulated asset. His voice broke as he recounted discovering his mother sleeping in her car, realizing how the Bradleys had used his desperate need to belong against both him and his family. The prosecution's final presentation showed the full scope of the Bradley scheme. Financial charts traced how they had systematically looted Trey's trust fund. Timeline graphics showed their calculated separation of mother and son. Security footage captured their private celebrations as each phase of their plan succeeded. As the evidence concluded, David Chen made a simple statement: "Your Honor, we are not just seeking justice for one family. We are asking the court to recognize how wealth and power were weaponized against an entire community, and to ensure it never happens again." In the quiet of his mother's hospital room, long after visiting hours had ended, Trey found Sarah's notebook. Hidden beneath her worn purse was a collection of letters she had written him daily since his departure, each one dated and never sent. His hands trembled as he opened to the first page, his mother's familiar handwriting bringing tears to his eyes. "My dearest son," the first entry began, "today you moved into your new penthouse. I watched from the diner window as they carried in your expensive furniture, wondering if any of it would make you as happy as the blanket Eleanor knit for your first bed." Each subsequent entry documented his transformation through his mother's eyes, her pride in his achievements tangled with fear for his soul. The letters revealed sacrifices he had never known. Sarah described selling her blood plasma to buy him birthday presents he had dismissed as inadequate. She wrote about working through chemotherapy sessions, timing her vomiting between serving tables to keep her jobs. Every page showed unwavering love, even as he had systematically erased her from his new life. Memories flooded back as he read. The way she had worked 3 jobs to keep him in good schools, how she stretched every dollar during hard times while preserving his dignity. He remembered her hands, once steady enough for surgery, growing calloused from cleaning other people's homes. Each recollection brought fresh shame at how easily he had discarded her for the Bradleys' false acceptance. Mrs. Henderson found him there at dawn, still reading, his expensive suit wrinkled from sitting all night. She silently handed him another box, this one containing every newspaper clipping about him, every school photo, every small reminder of his achievements that Sarah had carefully preserved while living in her car. The contrast between his mother's devotion and his own behavior hit him with physical force. The awakening continued as Trey revisited places from his past. Mr. Patterson's store, where he had once helped stock shelves for extra lunch money, now faced closure due to Bradley Development. The Chen's restaurant, where Amy's family had slipped him extra food during hard times, struggled under suddenly aggressive health inspections. Each location held memories of community support he had betrayed for artificial wealth. His father's journal, rescued from the trash where he had carelessly tossed it, revealed James Smith's dreams for his son. True wealth, his father had written, lies not in what we possess but in what we give to others. Eleanor's margin notes added wisdom. He had ignored money. Without compassion corrupts the soul. These voices from his past spoke clearer now than all of Brandon's carefully scripted advice. Walking through his luxury penthouse, Trey saw it with new eyes. Every expensive item testified to his fall designer clothes bought while his mother wore threadbare uniforms, gourmet meals delivered while she skipped eating to afford medication, art pieces that cost more than her annual salary decorating walls while she slept in her car. He began systematically packing it all away, each item a reminder of who he had become. The community's forgiveness proved harder to accept than their anger. Amy Chen still smiled when their paths crossed, though he had publicly snubbed her friendship. Marcus Washington's father nodded respectfully, despite Trey's previous disdain for his janitorial position. Their quiet dignity highlighted how far he had strayed from the values Sarah had taught him. In the hospital chapel, Trey found himself praying for the first time since the lottery win. Not for wealth or status, but for forgiveness from his mother, from the community, from himself. The simple wooden cross reminded him of childhood Sundays, when Sarah had taught him that character mattered more than possessions. His awakening culminated in a public speech at Preston Elementary, standing in the same gymnasium where Sarah had collapsed. Without notes or preparation, he spoke from his heart about the true cost of false pride. He described how the Bradleys had exploited his insecurities, how he had traded authentic love for artificial acceptance, how wealth had nearly destroyed his soul. Tears flowed freely as he acknowledged each person who had supported his family through hard times: Mr. Patterson's quiet generosity, Mrs. Henderson's constant care, the Chen family's kindness. He spoke about his mother's sacrifices, his voice breaking as he described discovering her living in her car while he dined at expensive restaurants. The transformation showed in small ways first. He began helping at the diner between hospital visits, wearing his old clothes, learning again the value of honest work. Regular customers who had watched him grow up welcomed him back without judgment, understanding that sometimes one must lose everything to find oneself. Sarah, watching from her hospital bed, saw her son re-emerge from behind the Bradleys' careful programming. His genuine smile returned, replacing the practiced social expression. His natural warmth surfaced again, breaking through layers of artificial sophistication. Most importantly, his eyes regained their childhood compassion, the quality that had most reflected his father's spirit. The hospital corridor echoed with the steady beep of monitors as Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly. The cancer, left untreated for too long while she prioritized Trey's needs, had spread aggressively. Dr. Martinez stood at her bedside, examining test results that painted an increasingly grim picture. "The chemotherapy isn't having the effect we hoped," he explained quietly to Trey, who hadn't left his mother's side for 3 days. The disease advanced significantly during the months she delayed treatment. He didn't need to add why she had delayed. They both knew she had chosen paying rent over medical care, trying to maintain a home for a son who no longer visited. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her hand clutching Eleanor's ring even in sleep. Her fingers had grown so thin that the ring threatened to slip off, but she refused to remove it. During lucid moments, she would ask about the diner, worried about letting down her regular customers. She never mentioned her pain, focusing instead on others until weakness forced her back into uneasy sleep. The community maintained a constant vigil. Mrs. Henderson organized a rotation of visitors, ensuring Sarah was never alone while Trey grabbed brief moments of rest. Mr. Patterson delivered fresh flowers daily, their bright colors contrasting sharply with the sterile hospital walls. The Chen family kept a steady supply of soup arriving, though Sarah could barely manage a few spoonfuls. Trey watched helplessly as his mother fought for each breath. His expensive watch now marked time between medication doses instead of social engagements. The designer clothes he had once prized lay crumpled in a corner as he kept his vigil in old jeans and a worn sweater. None of his former wealth could buy what he desperately needed: more time with his mother. The worst moment came during a late-night crisis. Sarah's breathing became labored, machines blaring warnings as medical staff rushed in. Trey found himself pressed against the wall, watching in terror as they fought to stabilize her. Through it all, Sarah's only sign of distress was trying to reach for him, wanting to comfort her son even as she struggled for life. Dr. Martinez pulled Trey aside after they managed to stabilize her. "She's been fighting this alone for too long," he said gently. The stress of homelessness, continuing to work through treatment, the emotional trauma, it's all taken a toll. We need to discuss options. The word options hung heavily in the air, carrying the weight of decisions no child should have to make about their parent. Sarah's colleagues from her nursing days began stopping by, their faces showing shock at seeing their once vibrant colleague so diminished. They remembered her steady hands in surgery, her compassion with patients, her dedication to healing others. Now she lay in the same hospital, where she had once saved lives, fighting for her own. Through it all, Sarah's primary concern remained Trey. Even semi-conscious, she would mumble worries about his future, his happiness, his return to the values she had taught him. Her mother's instinct to protect her child stayed strong, even as her body weakened. Each time she woke, her first words were always asking if Trey had eaten, if he was getting enough rest. The hospital's social worker found Trey one evening, staring out the window at the city lights. She carried Sarah's medical records, documenting months of ignored symptoms, mistreatments, and delayed care. Each page told the story of a mother's sacrifice, choosing her son's needs over her own health, until it was almost too late. As Sarah's condition reached a critical point, the wake-up calls Trey had received during the trial seemed small compared to this vigil. No courtroom revelation could match the impact of watching his mother fight for life, knowing his choices had contributed to her decline. The beeping monitors became a constant reminder of time he couldn't get back, of moments lost to false pride and artificial wealth. The Bradley family's retaliation came swiftly and mercilessly, even as Sarah fought for life in the hospital. Richard Bradley's first move targeted the entire neighborhood, announcing an emergency urban renewal project. That would demolish every building on the block, including Patterson's Market and the Chen family restaurant. Victoria's social warfare proved equally devastating. She orchestrated a whisper campaign suggesting Sarah's illness was fabricated for sympathy, while simultaneously ensuring that potential employers received anonymous warnings about hiring anyone connected to the Smith family. Her charity foundation suddenly withdrew funding from community programs that had supported Sarah, citing budget constraints. Brandon's revenge focused on destroying Trey's reputation at school. He released carefully edited versions of their conversations, making Trey appear manipulative and ungrateful. Social media accounts under fake names began spreading stories about Trey's true character, each post designed to isolate him further from his peers. The legal assault intensified through a barrage of civil suits. Bradley Development filed claims against every business and individual who had testified in court. Mr. Patterson received notice that his store lease violation would result in immediate eviction. The Chen family faced sudden health code inspections, while Mrs. Henderson's apartment building was scheduled for mandatory renovations. But local media, still partially under Bradley influence, began running stories questioning Sarah's competence as a mother. Old medical records were mysteriously leaked, suggesting she had been unfit to raise Trey even before the lottery win. Photos appeared showing her sleeping in her car, presented not as evidence of sacrifice but as proof of instability. The hospital where Sarah lay fighting for life suddenly faced pressure from Bradley-connected board members. Questions arose about her insurance coverage, her eligibility for financial assistance, even her right to continue treatment in their facility. Dr. Martinez found himself defending his medical decisions to administrators who had never before questioned his judgment. Property by property, the Bradleys began dismantling the community's support system. The laundromat, where Sarah had washed uniforms between shifts, closed due to code violations. The diner faced sudden tax audits. Even the small church where Sarah had once volunteered received notices about zoning irregularities. Victoria's social connections proved particularly venomous. She arranged for Sarah's previous employers to receive anonymous tips about missing items, creating a false history of dishonesty. Professional references disappeared, replaced by carefully crafted stories of unreliability. Each attack aimed to ensure that, even if Sarah recovered, she would struggle to rebuild her life. The pressure extended to anyone who tried to help. Local lawyers who had offered pro bono services found their other clients mysteriously cancelling. Small business owners who supported the Smiths faced sudden difficulties with permits and licenses. The message was clear: helping the Smiths meant facing the Bradleys' wrath. Brandon's final act of revenge came in the form of a video, carefully edited from hundreds of hours of footage. It showed Trey mocking his former life, dismissing his mother's sacrifices, embracing the Bradleys' values. The video went viral among Preston elementary parents, making it impossible for Trey to return to school without facing constant reminders of his betrayal. Through it all, Richard Bradley maintained his public image of concerned community leader. He expressed deep regret over the neighborhood's necessary redevelopment, while his company methodically destroyed lives. Each act of revenge was wrapped in corporate policy and legal procedure, making resistance almost impossible. The combined effect left the Smiths and their supporters reeling. Every attempt to help Sarah or support Trey met with immediate, calculated opposition. The Bradley family's message was clear: they might have lost in court, but they still held power over the community's fate. The storage facility's notice arrived while Sarah was undergoing another round of chemotherapy. All units would be cleared within 24 hours due to an emergency renovation ordered by Bradley Development. Inside their small unit lay the last remnants of the Smith family history: James's teaching awards, Eleanor's photo albums, Sarah's nursing diploma, and every piece of Trey's childhood that his mother had carefully preserved. Mrs. Henderson rushed to salvage what she could, but arrived to find the locks already changed. Through the facility's chain-link fence, she watched helplessly as workers tossed decades of memories into industrial dumpsters. Eleanor's handwritten recipes scattered in the wind, while James's journals disappeared into garbage bags. The workers ignored her pleas to at least let her retrieve the family photos. The loss of Eleanor's recipe box hit particularly hard. The small wooden container held more than cooking instructions. It contained Sarah's wedding photos, Trey's first drawings, and the last birthday card James had written before his death. Each recipe carried Eleanor's margin notes, little life lessons written beside ingredient lists, wisdom passed down through generations now lost to corporate revenge. James's briefcase, the one he had carried to school every day, contained his plans for helping underprivileged students. The leather was worn from years of use, but inside remained his detailed notes about each child he'd helped, including the one he was driving to meet the night of his accident. The briefcase disappeared into the dumpster, along with his dreams for educational equality. Sarah's nursing uniforms, preserved from her days at Memorial Hospital, represented years of dedicated service. Each pressed white outfit told stories of lives saved, comfort provided, and professional pride. Her medical textbooks, filled with careful annotations from years of study, joined them in the trash. The workers seemed particularly eager to destroy evidence of her accomplished past. Trey's childhood art projects, report cards, and school photos vanished in minutes. The height marks Sarah had carefully recorded on paper charts, the collection of world's best mom cards he had made in elementary school, the construction paper flowers from his first Mother's Day celebration, all disappeared into garbage bags marked for immediate disposal. The family Bible, passed down through Eleanor's family for generations, contained birth records, wedding dates, and pressed flowers from significant occasions. Its loss erased not just memories but their documented history. The pages that had recorded their family's journey through joy and sorrow were now destined for a landfill. Most devastating was the loss of Eleanor's unfinished quilt. She had started it when Sarah announced her pregnancy, incorporating fabric from family celebrations, a piece of Sarah's graduation gown, squares from James's favorite teaching jacket, bits of Trey's baby blanket. The unfinished project represented their connected stories, now torn apart by corporate greed. The workers found particular satisfaction in destroying Sarah's awards and certificates. Her medical school diploma, nursing licenses, and professional commendations were systematically ripped and discarded. Each torn document represented years of study and dedication, eliminated in seconds by people following Bradley orders. A small box of James's possessions from the night of his accident proved especially painful to lose. It contained his wedding ring, his favorite pen that had graded countless student papers, and the proposal letter he had written to Sarah. These final tangible connections to his life vanished into the growing pile of discarded memories. Mrs. Henderson managed to rescue only one item, a single photograph that had blown against the fence. It showed the family in happier times, Sarah in her nurse's uniform, James wearing his teacher's smile, and baby Trey held between them. Eleanor had captured the image during a Sunday picnic, everyone laughing at some forgotten joke. This lone survivor of their family archive now carried the weight of all they had lost. Patterson's Market closed first, ending 60 years of neighborhood service. Mr. Patterson stood on the sidewalk as workers removed his hand-painted signs, watching a lifetime of community building disappear. His pay-when-you-can notebook, filled with names of families he had helped through hard times, remained unpaid as Bradley Development's demolition crew arrived. The Chen family's restaurant fell next, their decades-old establishment declared in violation of suddenly discovered health codes. Mrs. Chen's famous soup, which had nourished generations of neighborhood children, served its last bowl on a Tuesday afternoon. Their daughter Amy watched silently as her parents packed away family photos that had lined the walls, each image marking years of immigrant dreams crushed by corporate power. Mrs. Henderson's apartment building received 30 days' notice for essential renovations. The elderly residents, many of whom had lived there for decades, faced impossible choices in a housing market they could no longer afford. The building's community room, where Sarah had once taught free health classes, became a staging area for construction equipment. The local church, where Sarah had volunteered at the food bank, lost its lease due to zoning irregularities. Sunday services moved to the park until winter weather made it impossible. The food pantry's contents were distributed in a final act of community service, leaving hungry families without their safety net. Small businesses fell like dominoes. The laundromat, where Sarah washed uniforms between shifts, the coffee shop that had employed struggling students, the second-hand store that had provided affordable clothes. Each closure represented another piece of community fabric torn away. Empty storefronts multiplied, their windows covered with Bradley Development's glossy promises of luxury renewal. The diner where Sarah had worked struggled longest, but even Big Mike's determination couldn't overcome strategic health inspections and sudden tax audits. Regular customers gathered for a final meal, sharing memories of conversations over coffee and comfort found during hard times. The staff worked their last shift with tears and dignity, knowing they served more than just food. Miss Martinez retired early when the library's funding was mysteriously cut, ending her after-hours program that had helped working parents. The children who had found sanctuary among her books now had nowhere to go after school. Her brother, Dr. Martinez, faced increasing pressure at his medical practice for treating patients regardless of their ability to pay. Officer Rivera received a transfer notice to a distant precinct, removing another protective presence from the neighborhood. His replacement, newly graduated and unfamiliar with the community, followed Bradley Security's lead in questioning residents who gathered in public spaces. The neighborhood's physical transformation accelerated. Trees that had provided summer shade for generations disappeared overnight, declared hazardous by newly hired inspectors. Park benches where elderly residents had gathered for decades were removed to prevent loitering. Each change erased another piece of community history. Local teachers who had supported Sarah and Trey found themselves under scrutiny, their jobs threatened by anonymous complaints. The school's free lunch program faced budget cuts, while funding for Bradley-sponsored events increased. Children from struggling families felt the change first, as resources they depended on vanished. The community's spirit, though battered, refused to break completely. Neighbors shared what little remained, creating informal support networks to replace lost services. The Chen family cooked from their home kitchen, continuing to feed those in need. Mr. Patterson advised families from his living room, sharing decades of business experience to help others survive. Yet each day brought new losses. The crossing guard who had watched over children for 20 years, the custodian who knew every student's name, the cafeteria worker who ensured no child went hungry, these quiet heroes of daily life disappeared as Bradley Development's influence spread. The neighborhood's character changed with each closure. Where local shops had created a vibrant street life, empty buildings awaited demolition. Community gathering spots became construction sites. The sounds of children playing, neighbors chatting, and local life conducting its daily business fell silent under the march of corporate progress. The safety deposit box key, found taped to Eleanor's diary, led Sarah and Trey to First National Bank's downtown branch. The elderly manager remembered Eleanor well, guiding them to a private viewing room where a large metal box held the final pieces of her carefully constructed puzzle. My dearest Sarah and Trey, Eleanor's letter began, dated just days before her death. If you're reading this, then the Bradleys have shown their true nature. I've spent years gathering evidence of their corruption, knowing someday they would target our family. The box contained meticulously organized files, each documenting different aspects of Bradley Development's illegal activities. The first folder contained photographs of Richard Bradley meeting with James Smith, dated the week before James's fatal accident. Eleanor's notes detailed how James had discovered Bradley Development's scheme to embezzle school district funds. The drunk driver's story that had devastated their family suddenly unraveled, revealing a carefully orchestrated tragedy. Victoria Bradley's Charity Foundation records showed years of systematic fraud. Eleanor, serving on various community boards, had quietly collected proof of how they laundered money through fake charitable donations. Each gala, each fundraiser, each philanthropic gesture masked complex financial crimes that she had documented with a teacher's attention to detail. Most damaging were the property records Eleanor had accumulated. She had tracked every displaced family, every shuttered business, every broken promise Bradley Development had left in its wake. Her records included sworn statements from former employees, copies of fraudulent contracts, and detailed timelines of their predatory practices. The evidence extended beyond financial crimes. Eleanor had discovered Brandon's involvement in a cheating ring at Preston Elementary, where wealthy students paid for advance copies of tests. Her documentation showed how the Bradley family had systematically corrupted the school system, using their influence to manipulate grades and admissions. A separate file contained proof of how Bradley Development had manipulated zoning laws and building inspections. Eleanor had photographed unsafe construction practices, recorded conversations about ignored violations, and compiled evidence of bribes paid to local officials. Each document represented another crack in the Bradleys' carefully maintained facade. Medical records revealed that Eleanor's fatal heart attack might not have been entirely natural. She had documented suspicious changes in her medication shortly after confronting Richard Bradley about his connection to James's death. Her final notes suggested she had expected retaliation but had continued gathering evidence anyway. The most powerful items were personal letters from families the Bradleys had destroyed, photographs of communities they had dismantled, newspaper clippings documenting their rise to power through others' losses. Eleanor had created a comprehensive record of how wealth without conscience corrupts everything it touches. A USB drive contained digital copies of everything, along with instructions for distribution to specific journalists, lawyers, and government officials. Eleanor had created a dead man's switch, ensuring that her evidence would emerge if anything happened to Sarah or Trey. The final document was a letter to Trey, sealed and marked for when you understand true wealth inside. Eleanor had written about James's dreams for his son, about Sarah's sacrifices, about the real meaning of success. "Money can buy power," she wrote, "but it can't buy the kind of wealth your mother has given you through her love." As they finished examining the contents, Sarah noticed one last envelope marked Plan B inside. They found detailed instructions for exposing the Bradley Empire, complete with contact information for trustworthy allies and strategies for protecting themselves during the fight ahead. Eleanor had left them not just evidence, but a roadmap for justice. The bank manager, watching them process these discoveries, finally spoke. "Mrs. Anderson asked me to tell you something if you ever came here," he said quietly. "She said to remind you that truth, like love, cannot stay buried forever. It always finds its way to light." The resistance began in Patterson's Market's basement, where the neighborhood gathered to review Eleanor's evidence. Mr. Patterson, despite his eviction notice, opened his store one last time, not for business, but for justice. The Chen family brought food, Mrs. Henderson brought determination, and the community brought years of suppressed anger against Bradley development. Amy Chen, using her tech skills, created a digital platform to share Eleanor's evidence. Her website Truth for Trey quickly went viral, displaying documents that exposed the Bradley family's corruption. Security footage, financial records, and personal testimonies painted a devastating picture of systematic exploitation. The local media, finally free from Bradley influence, began publishing daily exposes. Eleanor's carefully gathered evidence provided irrefutable proof of everything from fraudulent charity schemes to manipulated property deals. The journalists who had once feared the Bradleys' power now competed to break new aspects of the story. Former Bradley employees, emboldened by the growing movement, started coming forward. Housekeepers shared recordings of private conversations, drivers revealed overheard plans, and office workers produced copies of incriminating documents. Each new testimony added weight to Eleanor's evidence. Mrs. Henderson organized a protest outside the Bradley mansion, beginning with just a few elderly residents holding signs. The group grew hourly as displaced families, former employees, and community members joined. Their silent vigil, incorporating Eleanor's photographs of destroyed neighborhoods, created powerful imagery that national media couldn't ignore. The students of Preston Elementary staged their own rebellion. Led by Amy Chen and Marcus Washington, they created a documentary using smartphone footage of Brandon's bullying behavior and the Bradleys' influence over school policies. The video, showing how wealthy families had corrupted the education system, spread rapidly through social media. Local businesses still fighting Bradley development found unexpected support. When health inspectors arrived at the Chen's restaurant, dozens of customers refused to leave, live streaming the obviously targeted harassment. Officer Rivera, despite his transfer notice, continued documenting Bradley Security's intimidation tactics. Dr. Martinez coordinated medical professionals to expose how Bradley Development's actions had impacted community health. Their report detailed increased stress-related illnesses, delayed treatments due to displacement, and the human cost of corporate greed. Sarah's case became a powerful symbol of how the wealthy exploit the vulnerable. The church, though evicted from its building, continued serving the community from temporary locations. Each service became a gathering point for resistance, with prayers for justice mixed with planning sessions for protests. The food bank operated from members' homes, refusing to abandon those in need. Miss Martinez's former students created a social media campaign showcasing personal stories of Bradley Development's impact. The videos of elderly residents facing eviction, small business owners losing their livelihoods, and families struggling after displacement humanized the statistics in Eleanor's files. The uprising gained unexpected allies as Bradley clients began withdrawing from projects, unwilling to face public scrutiny. Construction crews refused to continue demolition work, banks delayed processing Bradley Development loans, and political supporters distanced themselves from the family. Community artists transformed boarded-up storefronts into powerful murals depicting Eleanor's evidence. Each painting told a story: James's suspicious accident, Sarah's struggle, the systematic destruction of neighborhood bonds. The art attracted media attention and supporters from across the city. Mr. Patterson turned his closing sale into a public testimony event. Instead of selling off inventory, he shared stories of families the Bradleys had harmed, using his store as a gathering place for collecting more evidence. His "everything must go" signs became symbols of community resistance. The movement grew beyond their neighborhood as other communities recognized similar patterns in Bradley Development's practices. Eleanor's meticulous documentation provided a template for exposing corporate exploitation elsewhere. What began as one family's fight for justice became a broader struggle against wealthy oppression. The reunion occurred in Sarah's hospital room, where the steady beep of monitors provided a rhythm to their reconciliation. Trey sat beside his mother's bed, holding her thin hand, Eleanor's ring catching the fluorescent light as their fingers intertwined. The evidence of their family's struggles was written in Sarah's gaunt features and Trey's tear-stained face. "Mum," Trey began, his voice cracking with emotion, "I found your letters." All of them. He pulled out the worn notebook filled with Sarah's daily messages, each page documenting her unwavering love through his darkest betrayals. "You never stopped being my mother, even when I stopped being your son." Sarah's response came in a weak whisper, but carried the strength of years of maternal love. "You were always my son," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "Even when the Bradleys had you, even when you couldn't see me, you were always my little boy." Her fingers traced the familiar features now stripped of their artificial sophistication. Mrs. Henderson brought James's old briefcase, salvaged from the storage unit's destruction. Together, mother and son explored its contents, his lesson plans, his dreams for educational equality, his last unfinished note about helping a struggling student. Each item connected them to the man whose values they were finally remembering to honor. They read Eleanor's diary together, discovering her quiet wisdom anew. Her observations about wealth's true meaning resonated differently now, after they had experienced both material riches and spiritual poverty. Her final message about love's enduring power brought fresh tears to both their eyes. The conversation flowed naturally between them for the first time in months, free from the artificial barriers of scheduled visits and social pretense. Trey spoke about his growing awareness of the Bradleys' manipulation, while Sarah shared stories of her silent vigils outside his penthouse. Each revelation helped bridge the gap between them. Sarah's hospital room transformed into a family space. The expensive flower arrangements from the Bradley sympathizers were replaced by Mr. Patterson's simple daisies and Mrs. Chen's homemade soup. These humble offerings carried more love than all the luxury that had nearly destroyed their relationship. Trey began spending nights in the hospital room, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair just as Sarah had once done in her car, watching over him. He helped the nurses care for her, learning again the meaning of service that his father had tried to teach. His designer clothes gave way to comfortable old sweaters, his practiced manners replaced by genuine concern. But they created new traditions in this sterile space. Every evening Trey would read aloud from James's journal, while Sarah shared memories of their early family life. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, rebuilding their connection through presence rather than words. The community joined their reunion in quiet ways. Amy Chen brought her homework, studying quietly in the corner as she had done in their old apartment. Marcus Washington's father buffed the floor with extra care, ensuring Sarah's room gleamed. Mrs. Henderson knitted in the visitor's chair, her needles clicking peacefully as mother and son healed their relationship. One evening, during a particularly honest conversation, Trey finally asked about the cancer when she had first known, why she hadn't told him, how she had managed alone. Sarah's answers, delivered without blame or bitterness, showed him the true meaning of unconditional love. Her only concern, even through her illness, had been protecting him. As Sarah's strength gradually returned, their bond deepened. Trey learned to read her unspoken needs, anticipating when she needed rest or comfort. Sarah watched her son's artificial polish fall away, revealing the compassionate child she had raised. Each day brought them closer to who they had been before wealth had threatened to destroy them. The transformation was most visible in small moments, Trey carefully combing Sarah's hair as it began growing back, Sarah teaching him again how to fold hospital corners on sheets, both of them sharing quiet laughter over old family jokes. These simple interactions held more richness than any luxury the Bradleys had offered. The final court session began with an unusual sight: Sarah walking into the courtroom under her own power, supported by Trey on one side and Mrs. Henderson on the other. Her cancer was in remission, her strength returning just in time to witness justice being served. The Bradley family sat on the opposite side, their usual arrogance replaced by grim resignation. Eleanor's evidence proved devastating. The judge reviewed documents showing how Bradley Development had systematically destroyed communities, manipulated vulnerable families, and corrupted local institutions. Each piece of proof had been meticulously organized, dated, and verified, leaving no room for legal maneuvering. Richard Bradley's composure finally cracked when the prosecutor presented evidence linking him to James's death. The drunk driver's story, unraveled as Eleanor's photographs and witness statements, revealed a carefully orchestrated accident. The courtroom fell silent as James's last notes about school fund embezzlement were read aloud. Victoria's charity foundation faced its own reckoning. Financial records showed years of money laundering disguised as philanthropy. The same galas where she had humiliated Sarah were exposed as elaborate schemes to hide illegal activities. Her social empire crumbled as former society friends rushed to distance themselves from the scandal. Brandon's testimony proved particularly damning. Under pressure, he revealed how they had targeted Trey from the beginning, planning his isolation and manipulation even before the lottery win. His video diaries, shown in court, displayed a callousness that shocked even their supporters. The practiced charm finally gave way to reveal the cruelty beneath. The judge's ruling was comprehensive. Bradley Development's assets were frozen pending criminal investigation. The family mansion would be converted into a community center, their business empire dismantled to repay those they had harmed. Each property they had seized would be returned to its rightful owners or converted to affordable housing. The community's vindication came in waves. Mr. Patterson received ownership of his store building, with additional compensation for years of harassment. The Chen family's restaurant was restored with funds for renovation. Mrs. Henderson's apartment building returned to resident control, with guarantees against future displacement. Sarah's medical expenses were ordered paid in full, with additional compensation for the Bradleys' role in delaying her treatment. Their attempt to separate mother and son through financial manipulation resulted in punitive damages that would ensure their security for life. Yet the greatest victory wasn't monetary, it was seeing justice served for James's death. Brandon faced his own consequences. His role in manipulating Trey and documenting their schemes led to community service requirements. He would spend years working under Mr. Patterson's supervision, learning the value of honest work and genuine community connection that he had once mocked. Victoria's carefully constructed social world collapsed completely. Her charity foundation was dissolved, its assets redirected to genuine community organizations. The society pages that had once celebrated her influence now documented her disgrace. Each carefully cultivated connection abandoned her as quickly as she had once abandoned others. Richard Bradley's final attempt to maintain control through legal maneuvering failed spectacularly. Eleanor's evidence had been too thorough, her preparation too complete. The corporate empire he had built through corruption crumbled under the weight of truth, just as she had planned. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration as the verdict was read. Years of fear, intimidation, and powerlessness ended with the bang of a judge's gavel. The community members who had fought so long for justice embraced, their tears mixing with relief and vindication. Sarah and Trey left the courthouse together, stepping into sunlight that seemed brighter somehow. The gathered crowd, Mr. Patterson, the Chen family, Mrs. Henderson, and dozens of others who had supported their fight broke into spontaneous applause. Not for the legal victory alone, but for the triumph of truth, love, and community over greed and corruption. Eleanor's final message, read aloud by the judge during sentencing, proved prophetic justice. Like love may sleep but never dies, truth finds its way to light, carried by those brave enough to stand together. Her legacy lived on not just in the evidence she gathered, but in the community she had helped preserve. Sarah's return to medical practice began slowly, in the same hospital where she had once been chief resident. Her hands, no longer trembling from exhaustion and illness, rediscovered their former steadiness. The nurse's station, where she had once served as a waitress's station, now welcomed her back as Dr. Sarah Smith, her journey from patient to healer completing a circle. Dr. Martinez watched proudly as she donned her white coat for the first time in years, the familiar weight settling on her shoulders like a homecoming. Her first patients were from the community Mrs. Henderson's arthritis, Mr. Patterson's blood pressure checks, the Chen family's regular physicals. Each appointment became a celebration of recovery, both hers and theirs. The hospital board, under new leadership after the Bradley scandal, created a free clinic program under Sarah's direction. She designed it based on James's vision of accessible healthcare, ensuring that no family would face the choices she had endured. Her experiences of poverty and illness shaped policies that prioritized compassion over profit. Trey often visited her at work, bringing lunch just as James had done years ago. He would find her in consultation with patients, her gentle manner unchanged by hardship. The same hands that had once served diner coffee now saved lives again, their strength restored by justice and love. Her recovery became the community's victory. Former patients sought her out, sharing stories of how her kindness as a waitress had matched her skill as a nurse. The diner's regulars, now her patients, spoke of how she had cared for them, even while fighting her own battles. Each testimony added to her healing. The hospital wing where she had received chemotherapy was transformed under her guidance into a support center for struggling families. She established programs combining medical care with practical assistance, understanding from experience how health and poverty intertwined. Her office door remained open to anyone needing help, regardless of their ability to pay. Eleanor's medical books, rescued from storage unit destruction, found new life in Sarah's teaching. She began mentoring young nurses, sharing not just medical knowledge but lessons about compassion's role in healing. Her students learned from both her expertise and her story, understanding that true healthcare encompassed more than just treatment. The most profound healing happened in quiet moments, checking Trey's throat when he caught a cold, just as she had done in his childhood, sharing coffee with Dr. Martinez between rounds. Their colleague relationship restored, helping Mrs. Henderson manage her medications with the same care she had once received. Sarah's recovery represented more than physical healing. Each day in her white coat reinforced that second chances were possible, that hardship could strengthen rather than break, that service to others remained life's greatest medicine. Her journey from doctor to waitress to patient and back to healer became a testament to resilience and redemption. The Eleanor Smith Foundation emerged from the transformed Bradley mansion, its marble halls now serving a different kind of wealth, Where Victoria had once hosted exclusive galas, community meetings filled rooms with genuine purpose. The grand staircase that had witnessed so much corruption now welcomed families seeking help and hope. The Foundation's first initiative combined James's educational dreams with Sarah's medical experience. They established scholarships for underprivileged students pursuing healthcare careers, each recipient mentored by medical professionals who understood their struggles. The program, named James Smith Scholars, ensured that financial barriers wouldn't prevent talented caregivers from serving their communities. Mr. Patterson headed the Small Business Support Program, using his decades of experience to help local entrepreneurs survive and thrive. The Foundation provided microloans, mentorship, and resources to ensure that future generations of family businesses could resist corporate takeovers. His old notebook of pay when you can customers became a template for compassionate business practices. The Chen family coordinated food security initiatives, transforming the mansion's industrial kitchen into a community resource. Cooking classes combined nutritional education with cultural preservation, while a food bank operated with dignity as its primary value. Mrs. Chen's famous soup recipes became part of a larger program teaching families to nourish both body and spirit. Mrs. Henderson directed senior support services, ensuring that elderly residents could age in place without fear of displacement. The Foundation renovated homes for accessibility, provided transportation to medical appointments, and created programs combating isolation. Her knitting circle expanded into a network of senior advocates protecting their neighbors' rights. Education remained central to their mission. The library, stocked with Eleanor's rescued books and new editions, offered after-school programs, adult education classes, and career development resources. Ms. Martinez returned from retirement to oversee literacy initiatives, her dedication inspiring a new generation of readers and learners. The Foundation's headquarters retained traces of Eleanor's influence. Her photographs lined hallways, not as decoration but as reminders of community history and resilience. The boardroom displayed her diary in a glass case, its pages open to her words about wealth's true meaning and service's lasting value. Each Foundation program reflected lessons learned from their struggles. Financial literacy classes taught families to recognize and resist predatory practices. Legal aid services protected vulnerable residents from corporate exploitation. Healthcare initiatives ensured that no one would face Sarah's impossible choices between treatment and survival. Trey worked alongside his mother, learning to transform their hard-won wisdom into practical support for others. His experiences with both wealth and poverty uniquely qualified him to help families navigate challenges while maintaining their dignity and values. The love that had survived manipulation and betrayal now powered their shared mission of community service. Trey's return to Preston Elementary came not as a wealthy donor, but as a teacher following his father's path. His classroom, modest and warm, welcomed students from all backgrounds. The same designer suits that had once marked his status now hung forgotten in closets, replaced by casual clothes more suited to sitting on reading rugs and working on art projects. His father's teaching journal became his guide, its worn pages offering wisdom about reaching struggling students and building confidence in young minds. Each lesson plan incorporated James's belief that every child deserved an equal chance at education. The margins, filled with Eleanor's notes, reminded him daily of education's power to transform lives. The transformation showed most clearly in small moments, helping a student struggling with lunch money, just as Amy Chen had once helped him staying late to tutor children whose parents worked multiple jobs, understanding from experience their challenges. Celebrating small victories with the same enthusiasm his mother had shown for his childhood achievements. His relationships with former classmates evolved into teaching partnerships. Amy Chen ran the school's computer lab, while Marcus Washington followed his father into education as the school counselor. Together, they created programs ensuring that no student would face the social isolation and pressure Trey had experienced. The lottery money, now managed with wisdom gained through hard lessons, funded scholarships and support services. Each decision about its use involved careful consideration of community impact, guided by Sarah's practical experience and Eleanor's written wisdom. Wealth became a tool for service rather than status. His greatest teaching moments often came from sharing his own story. Students learned about the difference between price and value, about friendship's true meaning, about the strength found in community. His journey from scholarship student to wealthy outcast and back to teacher offered powerful lessons about character's importance over currency. Brandon's community service requirement brought them together in unexpected ways. Under Trey's guidance, his former manipulator learned genuine lessons about service and community. Their past became a teaching tool, showing students how wealth without compassion corrupts while love and authenticity heal. Most meaningfully, Trey restored his role as Sarah's son. Their evening conversations over simple meals held more richness than any luxury dining had provided. He learned again the comfort of honest work, the joy of genuine connections, the satisfaction of contributing to others' growth. His father's dreams and mother's sacrifices finally found fulfillment in his chosen path. The classroom where he taught became a testament to redemption's possibility. Photos of his family, James teaching, Sarah nursing, Eleanor gardening, shared wall space with student artwork. Each image reminded his students that true wealth grows from love, service, and community rather than bank accounts and social status. On Eleanor's birthday, the community gathered in the Foundation's garden, where Sarah and Trey had planted her favorite roses. The evening air carried the scent of Mrs. Chen's soup mingling with Mr. Patterson's fresh bread. Under twinkling lights, 3 generations of neighborhood children played while their parents shared stories of survival and triumph. Sarah, now fully recovered, wore Eleanor's ring as she addressed the gathering. "My mother taught us that true wealth isn't counted in dollars," she began, her voice carrying across the quiet crowd. "It's measured in the lives we touch, the love we share, and the community we build." She squeezed Trey's hand, their journey from separation to reunion reflected in their matching smiles. The former Bradley mansion, transformed into a community center, stood as a testament to love's victory over greed. Where wealth had once built walls, compassion now opened doors. Each room held programs helping families avoid the struggles Sarah had faced: medical clinics, education services, financial counseling, all offered with dignity as their foundation. Trey shared his own lessons learned, speaking of how money had nearly cost him his soul until his mother's unconditional love and Eleanor's wisdom saved him. His students sat cross-legged on the lawn, absorbing a different kind of wealth lesson than the ones Brandon had once taught. Their faces reflected understanding beyond their years. The community's strength showed in their unity. Mr. Patterson's store, now employee-owned, provided groceries with both profit and compassion in mind. The Chen family's restaurant had expanded into a culinary training program for struggling youth. Mrs. Henderson's knitting circle had become a support network for elderly neighbors facing change. James's presence lived on through the scholarship program bearing his name, helping students who might otherwise face the impossible choices Sarah had confronted. His dream of education accessible to all found new life in classrooms where Trey and his colleagues taught more than just subjects. They taught values that money couldn't buy. Eleanor's final message, read annually at this gathering, seemed to echo through the garden. Remember that wealth's true measure lies not in what we possess, but in what we give. Love leaves marks deeper than gold, and community builds riches that no bank can hold. As evening deepened into night, the gathering continued, strengthened by shared experience and common purpose. Children who had once faced poverty now played without fear of hunger. Parents who had struggled alone now found support in collective care. The elderly who had feared displacement now aged securely in their homes. Sarah and Trey's story, woven into the community's larger tapestry, offered hope to others facing similar challenges. Their journey proved that redemption was possible, that love could overcome greed, that true wealth grew from the heart rather than the wallet. The garden lights twinkled like stars, illuminating faces filled with purpose and belonging. In this space, once a symbol of exclusion, the community had built something more valuable than any fortune. They had created a place where everyone's worth was measured by their character rather than their currency. Thank you for experiencing this emotional journey of love, redemption, and the true meaning of wealth. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What touched you most about Sarah and Trey's story? How did their journey of forgiveness and redemption resonate with your own experiences? If this story moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content that explores the depths of human relationships and life's most valuable lessons. Share this video with family and friends who might need a reminder that real wealth isn't measured in dollars but in love and authentic connections. Together, we can spread stories that matter. Don't forget to leave your comments below. What would you do if faced with similar choices? How has your own family's love helped you through difficult times? Your engagement helps our creative team continue producing content that touches hearts and changes lives.